Chapter 10 of The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Riddles of the Gospel. To understand the nature of this chapter, it is necessary to recur to the nature of this book. The argument, which is meant to be the backbone of the book, is of the kind called the reductio ad absurdum. It suggests that the results of assuming the rationalist thesis are more irrational than ours, but to prove it, we must assume that thesis. Thus, in the first section, I often treated man as merely an animal, to show that the effect was more impossible than if he were treated as an angel. In the sense in which it was necessary to treat man merely as an animal, it is necessary to treat Christ merely as a man. I have to suspend my own beliefs, which are much more positive, and assume this limitation even in order to remove it. I must try to imagine what would happen to a man who did really read the story of Christ as the story of a man, and even of a man of whom he had never heard before. And I wish to point out that a really impartial reading of that kind would lead, if not immediately to belief, at least to a bewilderment of which there is really no solution except in belief. In this chapter, for this reason, I shall bring in nothing of the spirit of my own creed. I shall exclude the very style of diction and even of lettering, which I should think fitting in speaking in my own person. I am speaking as an imaginary heathen human being, honestly staring at the gospel story for the first time. Now, it is not at all easy to regard the New Testament as a New Testament. It is not at all easy to realize the good news as new. Both for good and evil, familiarity fills us with assumptions and associations, and no man of our civilization, whatever he thinks of our religion, can really read the thing as if he had never heard of it before. Of course, it is in any case utterly unhistorical to talk as if the New Testament were a neatly bound book that had fallen from heaven. It is simply the selection made by the authority of the Church from a mass of early Christian literature. But apart from any such question, there is a psychological difficulty in feeling the New Testament as new. There is a psychological difficulty in seeing those well-known words simply as they stand and without going beyond what they intrinsically stand for. And this difficulty must indeed be very great, for the result of it is very curious. The result of it is that most modern critics and most current criticism, even popular criticism, makes a comment that is the exact reverse of the truth. It is so completely the reverse of the truth that one could almost suspect that they had never read the New Testament at all. We have all heard people say 100 times over, for they seem never to tire of saying it, that the Jesus of the New Testament is indeed a most merciful and humane lover of humanity, but that the Church has hidden this human character in repellent dogmas and stiffened it with ecclesiastical terrors till it has taken on an inhuman character. This is, I venture to repeat, very nearly the reverse of the truth. The thing is that it is the image of Christ in the churches that is almost entirely mild and merciful. It is the image of Christ in the Gospels that is a good many other things as well. The figure in the Gospels does indeed utter in words of almost heart-breaking beauty his pity for our broken hearts, but they are very far from being the only sort of words that he utters. Nevertheless, they are almost the only kinds of words that the Church in its popular imagery ever represents him as uttering. That popular imagery is inspired by a perfectly sound popular instinct. The mass of the poor are broken, and the mass of the people are poor, and for the mass of mankind the main thing is to carry the conviction of an incredible compassion of God. But nobody with his eyes open can doubt that it is chiefly this idea of compassion that the popular machinery of the Church does seek to carry. The popular imagery carries a great deal to access the sentiment of gentle Jesus meek and mild. It is the first thing that the outsider feels and criticizes in a pieta or a shrine of the Sacred Heart. As I say, while the art may be insufficient, I am not sure that the instinct is unsound. In any case, there is something appalling, something that makes the blood run cold, in the idea of having a statue of Christ in wrath. There is something unsupportable even to the imagination in the idea of turning the corner of a street or coming into the spaces of a marketplace to meet the petrifying petrifaction of that figure as it turned upon a generation of vipers, or that face as it looked at the face of a hypocrite. The Church can reasonably be justified, therefore, if she turns the most merciful face or aspect towards men, but it is certainly the most merciful aspect that she does turn. And the point is here that it is very much more specially and exclusively merciful than any impression that could be formed by a man merely reading the New Testament for the first time. A man simply taking the words of the story as they stand would form quite another impression, an impression full of mystery and possibly of inconsistency, but certainly not merely an impression of mildness. It would be intensely interesting, but part of the interest would consist in its leaving a good deal to be guessed at or explained. It is full of sudden gestures, evidently significant, except that we hardly know what they signify, of enigmatic silences, of ironical replies. The outbreaks of wrath, like storms above our atmosphere, do not seem to break out exactly where we should expect them, but to follow some higher weather chart of their own. The Peter, whom popular church teaching presents, is very rightly the Peter to whom Christ said in forgiveness, "Feed my lambs." He is not the Peter upon whom Christ turned as if he were the devil, crying in that obscure wrath, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Christ lamented with nothing but love and pity over Jerusalem, which was to murder him. We do not know what strange spiritual atmosphere or spiritual insight led him to sink Bethsaida lower in the pit than Sodom. I am putting aside for the moment all questions of doctrinal inferences or expositions, orthodox or otherwise. I am simply imagining the effect of a man's mind if he did really do what these critics are always talking about doing, if he did really read the New Testament without reference to orthodoxy, and even without reference to doctrine. He would find a number of things which fit in far less with the current unorthodoxy than they do with the current orthodoxy. He would find, for instance, that if there are any descriptions that deserved to be called realistic, they are precisely the descriptions of the supernatural. If there is one aspect of the New Testament, Jesus, in which he may be said to present himself eminently as a practical person, it is in the aspect of an exorcist. There is nothing meek and mild, there is nothing even in the ordinary sense mystical about the tone of the voice that says, "Hold thy peace and come out of him." It is much more like the tone of a very businesslike lion tamer or a strong-minded doctor dealing with a homicidal maniac. But this is only a side issue for the sake of illustration. I am not now raising these controversies, but considering the case of the imaginary man from the moon to whom the New Testament is new. Now, the first thing to note is that if we take it merely as a human story, it is in some ways a very strange story. I do not refer here to its tremendous and tragic culmination, or to any implications involving triumph in that tragedy. I do not refer to what is commonly called the miraculous element, for on that point philosophies vary and modern philosophies very decidedly waver. Indeed, the educated Englishman of today may be said to have passed from an old fashion, in which he would not believe in any miracles unless they were ancient, and adopted a new fashion in which he will not believe in any miracles unless they are modern. He used to hold that miraculous cures stopped with the first Christians, and is now inclined to suspect that they began with the first Christian scientists. But I refer here rather specially to unmiraculous and even to unnoticed and inconspicuous parts of the story. There are a great many things about it which nobody would have invented, for they are things that nobody has ever made any particular use of. Things which, if they were remarked at all, have remained rather as puzzles. For instance, there is that long stretch of silence in the life of Christ up to the age of 30. It is of all silences the most immense and imaginatively impressive. But it is not the sort of thing that anybody is particularly likely to invent in order to prove something, and nobody, so far as I know, has ever tried to prove anything in particular from it. It is impressive, but it is only impressive as a fact. There is nothing particularly popular or obvious about it as a fable. The ordinary trend of hero worship and myth-making is much more likely to say the precise opposite. It is much more likely to say, as I believe some of the Gospels rejected by the Church do say, that Jesus displayed a divine precocity and began his mission at a miraculously early age. And there is indeed something strange in the thought that he who of all humanity needed least preparation seems to have had most. Whether it was some mode of the divine humility, or some truth of which we see the shadow in the longer domestic tutelage of the higher creatures of the earth, I do not propose to speculate. I mention it simply as an example of the sort of thing that does, in any case, give rise to speculations, quite apart from recognized religious speculations. Now, the whole story is full of these things. It is not by any means, as boldly presented in print, a story that it is easy to get to the bottom of. It is anything but what these people talk of as a simple gospel. Relatively speaking, it is the gospel that has the mysticism, and the church that has the rationalism. As I should put it, of course, it is the gospel that is the riddle and the church that is the answer. But whatever be the answer, the gospel as it stands is almost a book of riddles. First, a man reading the gospel sayings would not find platitudes. If he had read, even in the most respectful spirit, the majority of ancient philosophers and of modern moralists, he would appreciate the unique importance of saying that he did not find platitudes. It is more than can be said even of Plato. It is much more than can be said of Epictetus or Seneca or Marcus Aurelius or Apollonius of Tyana. And it is immeasurably more than can be said of most of the agnostic moralists and the preachers of the ethical societies with their songs of service and their religion of brotherhood. The morality of most moralists, ancient and modern, has been one solid and polished cataract of platitudes flowing for ever and ever. That would certainly not be the impression of the imaginary independent outsider studying the New Testament. He would be conscious of nothing so commonplace, and in a sense of nothing so contagious, as that stream. He would find a number of strange claims that might sound like the claim to be the brother of the sun and moon, a number of very startling pieces of advice, a number of stunning rebukes, a number of strangely beautiful stories. He would see some very gigantesque figures of speech about the impossibility of threading a needle with a camel, or the possibility of throwing a mountain into the sea. He would see a number of very daring simplifications of the difficulties of life, like the advice to shine upon everybody indifferently, as does the sunshine, or not to worry about the future any more than the birds. He would find, on the other hand, some passages of almost impenetrable darkness, so far as he is concerned, such as the moral of the parable of the unjust steward. Some of these things might strike him as fables and some as truths, but none as truisms. For instance, he would not find the ordinary platitudes in favor of peace. He would find several paradoxes in favor of peace. He would find several ideals of non-resistance, which, taken as they stand, would be rather too pacific for any pacifist. He would be told in one passage to treat a robber not with passive resistance, but rather with positive and enthusiastic encouragement, if the terms be taken literally, heaping up gifts upon the man who had stolen goods. But he would not find a word of all that obvious rhetoric against war which has filled countless books and odes and orations. Not a word about the wickedness of war, the wastefulness of war, the appalling scale of the slaughter in war, and all the rest of the familiar frenzy. Indeed, not a word about war at all. There is nothing that throws any particular light on Christ's attitude towards organized warfare, except that he seems to have been rather fond of Roman soldiers. Indeed, it is another perplexity, speaking from the same external and human standpoint, that he seems to have got on much better with Romans than he did with Jews. But the question here is a certain tone to be appreciated by merely reading a certain text, and we might give any number of instances of it. The statement that the meek shall inherit the earth is very far from being a meek statement. I mean, it is not meek in the ordinary sense of mild and moderate and inoffensive. To justify it, it would be necessary to go very deep into history and anticipate things undreamed of then, and by many unrealized even now, such as the way in which the mystical monks reclaimed the lands which the practical kings had lost. If it was a truth at all, it was because it was a prophecy. But certainly, it was not a truth in the sense of a truism. The blessing upon the meek would seem to be a very violent statement in the sense of doing violence to reason and probability. And with this we come to another important stage in the speculation. As a prophecy it really was fulfilled, but it was only fulfilled long afterwards. The monasteries were the most practical and prosperous estates and experiments in reconstruction after the barbaric deluge. The meek did really inherit the earth, but nobody could have known anything of the sort at the time, unless indeed there was one who knew. Something of the same thing may be said about the incident of Martha and Mary, which has been interpreted in retrospect and from the inside by the mystics of the Christian contemplative life. But it was not at all an obvious view of it, and most moralists, ancient and modern, could be trusted to make a rush for the obvious. What torrents of effortless eloquence would have flowed from them to swell any slight superiority on the part of Martha? What splendid sermons about the joy of service and the gospel of work and the world left better than we found it, and generally all the 10,000 platitudes that can be uttered in favor of taking trouble by people who need take no trouble to utter them. If in Mary, the mystic and child of love, Christ was guarding the seed of something more subtle, Who was likely to understand it at the time? Nobody else could have seen Claire and Catherine and Teresa shining above the little roof at Bethany. It is so in another way, with that magnificent menace about bringing into the world a sword to sunder and divide. Nobody could have guessed then either how it could be fulfilled or how it could be justified. Indeed, some free thinkers are still so simple as to fall into the trap and be shocked at a phrase so deliberately defiant. They actually complain of the paradox for not being a platitude. But the point here is that if we could read the Gospel reports as things as new as newspaper reports, they would puzzle us and perhaps terrify us much more than the same things as developed by historical Christianity. For instance, Christ, after a clear allusion to the eunuchs of Eastern courts, said there would be eunuchs of the kingdom of heaven. If this does not mean the voluntary enthusiasm of virginity, it could only be made to mean something much more unnatural or uncouth. It is the historical religion that humanizes it for us by experience of Franciscans or of Sisters of Mercy. The mere statement standing by itself might very well suggest a rather dehumanized atmosphere. The sinister and inhuman silence of the Asiatic harem and divan. This is but one instance out of scores, but the moral is that the Christ of the Gospel might actually seem more strange and terrible than the Christ of the Church. I am dwelling on the dark or dazzling or defiant or mysterious side of the Gospel words, not because they had not obviously a more obvious and popular side, but because this is the answer to a common criticism on a vital point. The free thinker frequently says that Jesus of Nazareth was a man of his time, even if he was in advance of his time, and that we cannot accept his ethics as final for humanity. The free thinker then goes on to criticize his ethics, saying plausibly enough that men cannot turn the other cheek, or that they must take thought for the morrow, or that the self-denial is too ascetic or the monogamy too severe. But the zealots and the legionaries did not turn the other cheek any more than we do, if so much. The Jewish traders and Roman tax gatherers took thought for the morrow as much as we do, if not more. We cannot pretend to be abandoning the morality of the past for one more suited to the present. It is certainly not the morality of another age, but it might be of another world. In short, we can say that these ideals are impossible in themselves. Exactly what we cannot say is that they are impossible for us. They are rather notably marked by a mysticism which, if it be a sort of madness, would always have struck the same sort of people as mad. Take, for instance, the case of marriage and the relations of the sexes. It might very well have been true that a Galilean teacher taught things natural to a Galilean environment. But it is not. It might rationally be expected that a man in the time of Tiberius would have advanced a view conditioned by the time of Tiberius. But he did not. What he advanced was something quite different, something very difficult, but something no more difficult now than it was then. When, for instance, Muhammad made his polygamous compromise, we may reasonably say that it was conditioned by a polygamous society. When he allowed a man 4 wives, he was really doing something suited to the circumstances, which might have been less suited to other circumstances. Nobody will pretend that the 4 wives were like the 4 winds, something seemingly a part of the order of nature. Nobody will say that the figure 4 was written forever in stars upon the sky. But neither will anyone say that the figure 4 is an inconceivable ideal, that it is beyond the power of the mind of man to count up to 4, or to count the number of his wives and see whether it amounts to 4. It is a practical compromise, carrying with it the character of a particular society. If Muhammad had been born in Acton in the 19th century, we may well doubt whether he would instantly have filled that suburb with harems of 4 wives apiece. As he was born in Arabia in the 6th century, he did in his conjugal arrangements suggest the conditions of Arabia in the 6th century. But Christ, in his view of marriage, does not in the least suggest the conditions of Palestine in the 1st century. He does not suggest anything at all except the sacramental view of marriage as developed long afterwards by the Catholic Church. It was quite as difficult for people then as for people now. It was much more puzzling to people then than to people now. Jews and Romans and Greeks did not believe and did not even understand enough to disbelieve the mystical idea that the man and the woman had become one sacramental substance. We may think it an incredible or impossible ideal, but we cannot think it any more incredible or impossible than they would have thought it. In other words, whatever else is true, it is not true that the controversy has been altered by time. Whatever else is true, it is emphatically not true that the ideas of Jesus of Nazareth were suitable to his time, but are no longer suitable to our time. Exactly how suitable they were to his time is perhaps suggested in the end of his story. The same truth might be stated in another way by saying that if the story be regarded as merely human and historical, it is extraordinary how very little there is in the recorded words of Christ that ties him at all to his own time. I do not mean the details of a period, which even a man of the period knows to be passing. I mean the fundamentals, which even the wisest man often vaguely assumes to be eternal. For instance, Aristotle was perhaps the wisest and most wide-minded man who ever lived. He founded himself entirely upon fundamentals, which have been generally found to remain rational and solid through all social and historical changes. Still, he lived in a world in which it was thought as natural to have slaves as to have children, and therefore he did permit himself a serious recognition of a difference between slaves and freemen. Christ, as much as Aristotle, lived in a world that took slavery for granted. He did not particularly denounce slavery. He started a movement that could exist in a world with slavery, but he started a movement that could exist in a world without slavery. He never used a phrase that made his philosophy depend even upon the very existence of the social order in which he lived. He spoke as one conscious that everything was ephemeral, including the things that Aristotle thought eternal. By that time the Roman Empire had come to be merely the orbis terrarum, another name for the world. But he never made his morality dependent on the existence of the Roman Empire, or even on the existence of the world. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. The truth is that when critics have spoken of the local limitations of the Galilean, it has always been a case of the local limitations of the critics. He did undoubtedly believe in certain things that one particular modern sect of materialists do not believe. But they were not things particularly peculiar to his time. It would be nearer the truth to say that the denial of them is quite peculiar to our time. Doubtless it would be nearer still to the truth to say merely that a certain solemn social importance in the minority disbelieving them is peculiar to our time. He believed, for instance, in evil spirits or in the psychic healings of bodily ills, but not because he was a Galilean born under Augustus. It is absurd to say that a man believed things because he was a Galilean under Augustus, when he might have believed the same things if he had been an Egyptian under Tutankhamun, or an Indian under Genghis Khan. But with this general question of the philosophy of diabolism or of divine miracles I deal elsewhere, it is enough to say that the materialists have to prove the impossibility of miracles against the testimony of all mankind, not against the prejudices of provincials in North Palestine under the first Roman emperors. What they have to prove, for the present argument, is the presence in the Gospels of those particular prejudices of those particular provincials. And humanly speaking, it is astonishing how little they can produce even to make a beginning of proving it. So it is in this case of the sacrament of marriage. We may not believe in sacraments, as we may not believe in spirits, but it is quite clear that Christ believed in the sacrament in his own way, and not in any current or contemporary way. He certainly did not get his argument against divorce from the Mosaic law or the Roman law or the habits of the Palestinian people. It would appear to his critics then exactly what it appears to his critics now, an arbitrary and transcendental dogma coming from nowhere save in the sense that it came from him. I am not at all concerned here to defend that dogma. The point here is that it is just as easy to defend it now as it was to defend it then. It is an ideal altogether outside time, difficult at any period, impossible at no period. In other words, if anyone says it is what might be expected of a man walking about in that place at that period, we can quite fairly answer that it is much more like what we mean to be the mysterious utterance of a being beyond man, if he walked alive among men. I maintain, therefore, that a man reading the New Testament frankly and freshly would not get the impression of what is now often meant by a human Christ. The merely human Christ is a made-up figure, a piece of artificial selection, like the merely evolutionary man. Moreover, there have been too many of these human Christs found in the same story, just as there have been too many keys to mythology found in the same stories. 3 or 4 separate schools of rationalism have worked over the ground and produced 3 or 4 equally rational explanations of his life. The first rational explanation of his life was that he never lived, and this in turn gave an opportunity for 3 or 4 different explanations, as that he was a sun myth or a corn myth or any other kind of myth that is also a monomania. Then the idea that he was a divine being who did not exist gave place to the idea that he was a human being who did exist. In my youth it was the fashion to say that he was merely an ethical teacher in the manner of the Essenes, who had apparently nothing very much to say that Hillel or 100 other Jews might not have said, as that it is a kindly thing to be kind and an assistance to purification to be pure. Then somebody said he was a madman with a messianic delusion. Then others said he was indeed an original teacher because he cared about nothing but socialism, or, as others said, about nothing but pacifism. Then a more grimly scientific character appeared who said that Jesus would never have been heard of at all except for his prophecies of the end of the world. He was important merely as a millenarian like Dr. Cumming, and created a provincial scare by announcing the exact date of the crack of doom. Among other variants on the same theme was the theory that he was a spiritual healer and nothing else, a view implied by Christian Science, which has really to expound a Christianity without the crucifixion in order to explain the curing of Peter's wife's mother or the daughter of a centurion. There is another theory that concentrates entirely on the business of diabolism, and what it would call the contemporary superstition about demoniacs, as if Christ, like a young deacon taking his first orders, had got as far as exorcism and never got any further. Now each of these explanations in itself seems to me singularly inadequate, but taken together they do suggest something of the very mystery which they miss. There must surely have been something not only mysterious but many-sided about Christ, if so many smaller Christs can be carved out of him. If the Christian Scientist is satisfied with him as a spiritual healer, and the Christian Socialist is satisfied with him as a social reformer, so satisfied that they do not even expect him to be anything else, it looks as if he really covered rather more ground than they could be expected to expect. And it does seem to suggest that there might be more than they fancy in these other mysterious attributes of casting out devils or prophesying doom. Above all, would not such a new reader of the New Testament stumble over something that would startle him much more than it startles us? I have here more than once attempted the rather impossible task of reversing time and the historic method, and in fancy looking forward to the facts instead of backwards through the memories. So I have imagined the monster that man might have seemed at first to the mere nature around him. We should have a worse shock if we really imagined the nature of Christ named for the first time. What should we feel at the first whisper of a certain suggestion about a certain man? Certainly it is not for us to blame anybody who should find that first wild whisper merely impious and insane. On the contrary, stumbling on that rock of scandal is the first step. Stark staring incredulity is a far more loyal tribute to that truth than a modernist metaphysic that would make it out merely a matter of degree. It were better to rend our robes with a great cry against blasphemy like Caiaphas in the judgment, or to lay hold of the man as a maniac possessed of devils like the kinsman and the crowd, rather than to stand stupidly debating fine shades of pantheism in the presence of so catastrophic a claim. There is more of the wisdom that is won with surprise in any simple person, full of the sensitiveness of simplicity, who should expect the grass to wither and the birds to drop dead out of the air, when a strolling carpenter's apprentice said calmly and almost carelessly, like one looking over his shoulder, "Before Abraham was, I am." End of chapter 10. Chapter 12 of The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The witness of the Heretics. Christ founded the church with two great figures of speech in the final words to the apostles who received authority to found it. The first was the phrase about founding it on Peter as on a rock. The second was the symbol of the keys. About the meaning of the former there is naturally no doubt in my own case, but it does not directly affect the argument here save in two more secondary aspects. It is yet another example of a thing that could only fully expand and explain itself afterwards, and even long afterwards. And it is yet another example of something the very reverse of simple and self-evident even in the language, insofar as it described a man as a rock when he had much more the appearance of a reed. But the other image of the keys has an exactitude that has hardly been exactly noticed. The keys have been conspicuous enough in the art and heraldry of Christendom, but not everyone has noted the peculiar aptness of the allegory. We have now reached the point in history where something must be said of the first appearance and activities of the Church in the Roman Empire, and for that brief description nothing could be more perfect than that ancient metaphor. The early Christian was very precisely a person carrying about a key, or what he said was a key. The whole Christian movement consisted in claiming to possess that key. It was not merely a vague forward movement which might be better represented by a battering ram. It was not something that swept along with it similar or dissimilar things, as does a modern social movement. As we shall see in a moment, it rather definitely refused to do so. It definitely asserted that there was a key and that it possessed that key and that no other key was like it. In that sense, it was as narrow as you please. Only it happened to be the key that could unlock the prison of the whole world and let in the white daylight of liberty. The creed was like a key in three aspects, which can be most conveniently summed up under this symbol. First, a key is above all things a thing with a shape. It is a thing that depends entirely upon keeping its shape. The Christian creed is above all things the philosophy of shapes and the enemy of shapelessness. That is where it differs from all that formless infinity, Manichaean or Buddhist, which makes a sort of pool of night in the dark heart of Asia, the ideal of uncreating all the creatures. That is where it differs also from the analogous vagueness of mere evolutionism, the idea of creatures constantly losing their shape. A man told that his solitary latchkey had been melted down with a million others into a Buddhistic unity would be annoyed. But a man told that his key was gradually growing and sprouting in his pocket and branching into new wards or complications would not be more gratified. Second, the shape of a key is in itself a rather fantastic shape. A savage who did not know it was a key would have the greatest difficulty in guessing what it could possibly be. And it is fantastic because it is in a sense arbitrary. A key is not a matter of abstractions. In that sense, a key is not a matter of argument. It either fits the lock or it does not. It is useless for men to stand disputing over it, considered by itself, or reconstructing it on pure principles of geometry or decorative art. It is senseless for a man to say he would like a simpler key. It would be far more sensible to do his best with a crowbar. And thirdly, as the key is necessarily a thing with a pattern, so this was one having in some ways a rather elaborate pattern. When people complain of the religion being so early complicated with theology and things of the kind, they forget that the world had not only got into a hole, but had got into a whole maze of holes and corners. The problem itself was a complicated problem. It did not, in the ordinary sense, merely involve anything so simple as sin. It was also full of secrets, of unexplored and unfathomable fallacies, of unconscious mental diseases, of dangers in all directions. If the faith had faced the world only with the platitudes about peace and simplicity some moralists would confine it to, it would not have had the faintest effect on that luxurious and labyrinthine lunatic asylum. What it did do, we must now roughly describe. It is enough to say here that there was undoubtedly much about the key that seemed complex. Indeed, there was only one thing about it that was simple. It opened the door. There are certain recognized and accepted statements in this matter which may for brevity and convenience be described as lies. We have all heard people say that Christianity arose in an age of barbarism. They might just as well say that Christian Science arose in an age of barbarism. They may think Christianity was a symptom of social decay, as I think Christian Science a symptom of mental decay. They may think Christianity a superstition that ultimately destroyed a civilization, as I think Christian Science a superstition capable, if taken seriously, of destroying any number of civilizations. But to say that a Christian of the 4th or 5th centuries was a barbarian living in a barbarous time is exactly like saying that Mrs. Eddy was a Red Indian. And if I allowed my constitutional impatience with Mrs. Eddy to impel me to call her a Red Indian, I should incidentally be telling a lie. We may like or dislike the imperial civilization of Rome in the 4th century. We may like or dislike the industrial civilization of America in the 19th century, but that they both were what we commonly mean by a civilization, no person of common sense would deny if he wanted to. This is a very obvious fact, but it is also a very fundamental one, and we must make it the foundation of any further description of constructive Christianity in the past. For good or evil, it was preeminently the product of a civilized age, perhaps of an over-civilized age. This is the first fact apart from all praise or blame. Indeed, I am so unfortunate as not to feel that I praise a thing when I compare it to Christian Science. But it is at least desirable to know something of the savour of a society in which we are condemning or praising anything, and the science that connects Mrs. Eddy with tomahawks or the Mater Dolorosa with totems may, for our general convenience, be eliminated. The dominant fact, not merely about the Christian religion, but about the whole pagan civilization, was that which has been more than once repeated in these pages. The Mediterranean was a lake, in the real sense of a pool, in which a number of different cults or cultures were, as the phrase goes, pooled. Those cities facing each other round the circle of the lake became more and more one cosmopolitan culture. On its legal and military side it was the Roman Empire, but it was very many-sided. It might be called superstitious in the sense that it contained a great number of varied superstitions, but by no possibility can any part of it be called barbarous. In this level of cosmopolitan culture arose the Christian religion and the Catholic Church, and everything in the story suggests that it was felt to be something new and strange. Those who have tried to suggest that it evolved out of something much milder or more ordinary have found that, in this case, their evolutionary method is very difficult to apply. They may suggest that Essenes or Ebionites or such things were the seed, but the seed is invisible. The tree appears very rapidly full-grown, and the tree is something totally different. It is certainly a Christmas tree in the sense that it keeps the kindliness and moral beauty of the story of Bethlehem, but it was as ritualistic as the 7-branched candlestick, and the candles it carried were considerably more than were probably permitted by the first prayer book of Edward VI. It might well be asked, indeed, why anyone accepting the Bethlehem tradition should object to golden or gilded ornament, since the Magi themselves brought gold, why he should dislike incense in the church, since incense was brought even to the stable. But these are controversies that do not concern me here. I am concerned only with the historical fact, more and more admitted by historians, that very early in its history this thing became visible to the civilization of antiquity, and that already the church appeared as a church, with everything that is implied in a church and much that is disliked in a church. We will discuss in a moment how far it was like other ritualistic or magical or ascetical mysteries in its own time. It was certainly not in the least like merely ethical or idealistic movements in our time. It had a doctrine, it had a discipline, it had sacraments, it had degrees of initiation, it admitted people and expelled people, it affirmed one dogma with authority and repudiated another with anathemas. If all these things be the marks of Antichrist, the reign of Antichrist followed very rapidly upon Christ. Those who maintain that Christianity was not a church but a moral movement of idealists have been forced to push the period of its perversion or disappearance further and further back. A bishop of Rome writes claiming authority in the very lifetime of St. John the Evangelist, and it is described as the first papal aggression. A friend of the apostles writes of them as men he knew and says they taught him the doctrine of the sacrament, and Mr. Wells can only murmur that the reaction towards barbaric blood rites may have happened rather earlier than might be expected. The date of the fourth gospel, which at one time was steadily growing later and later, is now steadily growing earlier and earlier, until critics are staggered at the dawning and dreadful possibility that it might be something like what it professes to be. The last limit of an early date for the extinction of true Christianity has probably been found by the latest German professor whose authority is invoked by Dean Inge. This learned scholar says that Pentecost was the occasion for the first founding of an ecclesiastical, dogmatic, and despotic church utterly alien to the simple ideals of Jesus of Nazareth. This may be called, in a popular as well as a learned sense, the limit. What do professors of this kind imagine that men are made of? Suppose it were a matter of any merely human movement, let us say that of the conscientious objectors. Some say the early Christians were pacifists. I do not believe it for a moment, but I am quite ready to accept the parallel for the sake of the argument. Tolstoy, or some great preacher of peace among peasants, has been shot as a mutineer for defying conscription, and a little while afterwards his few followers meet together in an upper room in remembrance of him. They never had any reason for coming together except that common memory. They are men of many kinds with nothing to bind them, except that the greatest event in all their lives was this tragedy of the teacher of universal peace. They are always repeating his words, revolving his problems, trying to imitate his character. The pacifists meet at their Pentecost and are possessed of a sudden ecstasy of enthusiasm and wild rush of the whirlwind of inspiration, in the course of which they proceed to establish universal conscription, to increase the navy estimates, to insist on everybody going about armed to the teeth, and on all the frontiers bristling with artillery. The proceedings concluded with the singing of "Boys of the Bulldog breed" and "Don't let them scrap the British Navy." That is something like a fair parallel to the theory of these critics, that the transition from their idea of Jesus to their idea of Catholicism would have been made in the little upper room at Pentecost. Surely anybody's common sense would tell him that enthusiasts, who only met through their common enthusiasm for a leader whom they loved, would not instantly rush away to establish everything that he hated. No, if the ecclesiastical and dogmatic system is as old as Pentecost, it is as old as Christmas. If we trace it back to such very early Christians, we must trace it back to Christ. It may begin, then, with these two negations. It is nonsense to say that the Christian faith appeared in a simple age, in the sense of an unlettered and gullible age. It is equally nonsense to say that the Christian faith was a simple thing, in the sense of a vague or childish or merely instinctive thing. Perhaps the only point in which we could possibly say that the Church fitted into the pagan world is the fact that they were both not only highly civilized but rather complicated. They were both emphatically many-sided, but antiquity was then a many-sided whole, like a hexagonal whole waiting for an equally hexagonal stopper. In that sense, only the Church was many-sided enough to fit the world. The 6 sides of the Mediterranean world faced each other across the sea and waited for something that should look always at once. The Church had to be both Roman and Greek and Jewish and African and Asiatic. In the very words of the Apostle of the Gentiles, it was indeed all things to all men. Christianity then was not merely crude and simple, and was the very reverse of the growth of a barbaric time. But when we come to the contrary charge, we come to a much more plausible charge. It is very much more tenable that the faith was but a final phase of the decay of civilization, in the sense of the excess of civilization, that this superstition was a sign that Rome was dying, and dying of being much too civilized. That is an argument much better worth considering, and we will proceed to consider it. At the beginning of this book I ventured on a general summary of it, in a parallel between the rise of humanity out of nature and the rise of Christianity out of history. I pointed out that in both cases what had gone before might imply something coming after, but did not in the least imply what did come after. If a detached mind had seen certain apes, it might have deduced more anthropoids. It would not have deduced man or anything within 1,000 miles of what man has done. In short, it might have seen Pithecanthropus, or the missing link looming in the future, if possibly almost as dimly and doubtfully as we see him looming in the past. But if it foresaw him appearing, it would also foresee him disappearing and leaving a few faint traces, just as he has left a few faint traces, if they are traces. To foresee that missing link would not be to foresee man or anything like man. Now this earlier explanation must be kept in mind because it is an exact parallel to the true view of the Church, and the suggestion of it having evolved naturally out of the empire in decay. The truth is that in one sense a man might very well have predicted that the imperial decadence would produce something like Christianity, that is, something a little like and gigantically different. A man might very well have said, for instance, pleasure has been pursued so extravagantly that there will be a reaction into pessimism. Perhaps it will take the form of asceticism, men will mutilate themselves instead of merely hanging themselves. Or a man might very reasonably have said, if we weary of our Greek and Latin gods, we shall be hankering after some Eastern mystery or other. There will be a fashion in Persians or Hindus. Or a man of the world might well have been shrewd enough to say, powerful people are picking up these fads, some day the court will adopt one of them, and it may become official. Or yet another, and gloomier prophet, might be pardoned for saying, the world is going downhill, dark and barbarous superstitions will return, it does not matter much which, they will all be formless and fugitive like dreams of the night. Now, it is the intense interest of the case that all these prophecies were really fulfilled, but it was not the Church that fulfilled them. It was the Church that escaped from them, confounded them, and rose above them in triumph. Insofar as it was probable that the mere nature of hedonism would produce a mere reaction of asceticism, it did produce a mere reaction of asceticism. It was the movement called Manichaean, and the Church was its mortal enemy. Insofar as it would have naturally appeared at that point of history, it did appear. It did also disappear, which was equally natural. The mere pessimist reaction did come with the Manichees, and did go with the Manichees, but the Church did not come with them or go with them, and she had much more to do with their going than with their coming. Or again, insofar as it was probable that even the growth of skepticism would bring in a fashion of Eastern religion, it did bring it in. Mithras came from far beyond Palestine, out of the heart of Persia, bringing strange mysteries of the blood of bulls. Certainly, there was everything to show that some such fashion would have come in any case. But certainly there is nothing in the world to show that it would not have passed away in any case. Certainly, an Oriental fad was something eminently fitted to the 4th or 5th century. But that hardly explains it having remained to the 20th century, and still going strong. In short, insofar as things of the kind might have been expected then, things like Mithraism were experienced then, but it scarcely explains our more recent experiences. And if we were still Mithraists, merely because Mithraic headdresses and other Persian apparatuses might be expected to be all the rage in the days of Domitian, it would almost seem by this time that we must be a little dowdy. It is the same, as will be suggested in a moment, with the idea of official favoritism. Insofar as such favoritism shown towards a fad was something that might have been looked for during the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, it was something that did exist in the empire and did decline and fall with it. It throws no sort of light on the thing that resolutely refused to decline and fall, that grew steadily while the other was declining and falling, and which even at this moment is going forward with fearless energy when another eon has completed its cycle and another civilization seems almost ready to fall or to decline. Now the curious fact is this, that the very heresies which the early church is blamed for crushing testify to the unfairness for which she is blamed. Insofar as something deserved the blame, it was precisely the things that she is blamed for blaming. Insofar as something was merely a superstition, she herself condemned that superstition. Insofar as something was a mere reaction into barbarism, she herself resisted it because it was a reaction into barbarism. Insofar as something was a fad of a fading empire that died and deserved to die, it was the Church alone that killed it. The Church is reproached for being exactly what the heresy was repressed for being. The explanations of the evolutionary historians and higher critics do really explain why Arianism and Gnosticism and Nestorianism were born, and also why they died. They do not explain why the Church was born or why she has refused to die. Above all, they do not explain why she should have made war on the very evils she is supposed to share. Let us take a few practical examples of the principle. The principle that if there was anything that was really a superstition of the dying empire, it did really die with the dying empire, and certainly was not the same as the very thing that destroyed it. For this purpose, we will take in order 2 or 3 of the most ordinary explanations of Christian origins among the modern critics of Christianity. Nothing is more common, for instance, than to find such a modern critic writing something like this. Christianity was above all a movement of ascetics, a rush into the desert, a refuge in the cloister, a renunciation of all life and happiness. And this was a part of a gloomy and inhuman reaction against nature itself, a hatred of the body, a horror of the material universe, a sort of universal suicide of the senses and even of the self. It came from an Eastern fanaticism like that of the fakirs, and was ultimately founded on an Eastern pessimism which seems to feel existence itself as an evil. Now, the most extraordinary thing about this is that it is all quite true. It is true in every detail except that it happens to be attributed entirely to the wrong person. It is not true of the Church, but it is true of the heretics condemned by the Church. It is as if one were to write a most detailed analysis of the mistakes and misgovernments of the ministers of George III, merely with the small inaccuracy that the whole story was told about George Washington, or as if somebody made a list of the crimes of the Bolshevists with no variation except that they were all attributed to the Tsar. The early church was, indeed, very ascetic in connection with a totally different philosophy, but the philosophy of a war on life and nature as such really did exist in the world if the critics only knew where to look for it. What really happened was this. When the faith first emerged into the world, the very first thing that happened to it was that it was caught in a swarm of mystical and metaphysical sects, mostly out of the East, like one lonely golden bee caught in a swarm of wasps. To the ordinary onlooker, there did not seem to be much difference, or anything beyond a general buzz. Indeed, in a sense, there was not much difference so far as stinging and being stung were concerned. The difference was that only one golden dot in all that whirring gold dust had the power of going forth to make hives for all humanity, to give the world honey and wax, or, as was so finely said in a context too easily forgotten, the two noblest things, which are sweetness and light. The wasps all died that winter, and half the difficulty is that hardly anyone knows anything about them, and most people do not know that they ever existed, so that the whole story of the first phase of our religion is lost. Or, to vary the metaphor, when this movement or some other movement pierced the dike between the East and West, and brought more mystical ideas into Europe, it brought with it a whole flood of other mystical ideas besides its own, most of them ascetical, and nearly all of them pessimistic. They very nearly flooded and overwhelmed the purely Christian element. They came mostly from that region that was a sort of dim borderland between the Eastern philosophies and the Eastern mythologies, and which shared with the wilder philosophers that curious craze for making fantastic patterns of the cosmos in the shape of maps and genealogical trees. Those that are supposed to derive from the mysterious Manes are called Manichaean. Kindred cults are more generally known as Gnostic. They are mostly of a labyrinthine complexity, but the point to insist on is the pessimism, the fact that nearly all, in one form or another, regarded the creation of the world as the work of an evil spirit. Some of them had that Asiatic atmosphere that surrounds Buddhism, the suggestion that life is a corruption of the purity of being. Some of them suggested a purely spiritual order, which had been betrayed by the coarse and clumsy trick of making such toys as the sun and moon and stars. Anyhow, all this dark tide out of the metaphysical sea in the midst of Asia poured through the dikes simultaneously with the creed of Christ. But it is the whole point of the story that the two were not the same, that they flowed like oil and water. That creed remained in the shape of a miracle, a river still flowing through the sea. And the proof of the miracle was practical once more. It was merely that while all the sea was salt and bitter with the savour of death, of this one stream in the midst of it a man could drink. Now that purity was preserved by dogmatic definitions and exclusions. It could not possibly have been preserved by anything else. If the Church had not denounced the Manichaeans, it might have become merely Manichaean. If it had not renounced the Gnostics, it might have become Gnostic. But by the fact that it did renounce them, it proved that it was not either Gnostic or Manichaean. At any rate, it proved that something was not either Gnostic or Manichaean, and what could it be that condemned them if it was not the original good news of the runners from Bethlehem and the trumpet of the resurrection? The early church was ascetic, but she proved that she was not pessimistic simply by condemning the pessimists. The creed declared that man was sinful, but it did not declare that life was evil, and it proved it by damning those who did. The condemnation of the early heretics is itself condemned as something crabbed and narrow, but it was in truth the very proof that the Church meant to be brotherly and broad. It proved that the primitive Catholics were specially eager to explain that they did not think man utterly vile, that they did not think life incurably miserable, that they did not think marriage a sin or procreation a tragedy. They were ascetic because asceticism was the only possible purge of the sins of the world, but in the very thunder of their anathemas they affirmed forever that their asceticism was not to be anti-human or anti-natural, that they did wish to purge the world and not destroy it, and nothing else except those anathemas could possibly have made it clear amid a confusion which still confuses them with their mortal enemies. Nothing else but dogma could have resisted the riot of imaginative invention with which the pessimists were waging their war against nature, with their eons and their demiurge, their strange logos and their sinister Sophia. If the Church had not insisted on theology, it would have melted into a mad mythology of the mystics, yet further removed from reason or even from rationalism, and above all, yet further removed from life and from the love of life. Remember that it would have been an inverted mythology, one contradicting everything natural in paganism, a mythology in which Pluto would be above Jupiter and Hades hang higher than Olympus, in which Brahma and all that has the breath of life would be subject to Siva, shining with the eye of death. That the early church was itself full of an ecstatic enthusiasm for renunciation and virginity makes this distinction much more striking and not less so. It makes all the more important the place where the dogma drew the line. A man might crawl about on all fours like a beast because he was an ascetic. He might stand night and day on the top of a pillar and be adored for being an ascetic. But he could not say that the world was a mistake or the marriage state a sin without being a heretic. What was it that thus deliberately disengaged itself from Eastern asceticism by sharp definition and fierce refusal, if it was not something with an individuality of its own, and one that was quite different? If the Catholics are to be confused with the Gnostics, we can only say it was not their fault if they are. And it is rather hard that the Catholics should be blamed by the same critics for persecuting the heretics and also for sympathizing with the heresy. The Church was not a Manichaean movement, if only because it was not a movement at all. It was not even merely an ascetical movement, because it was not a movement at all. It would be nearer the truth to call it the tamer of asceticism than the mere leader or loosener of it. It was a thing having its own theory of asceticism, its own type of asceticism, but most conspicuous at the moment as the moderator of other theories and types. This is the only sense that can be made, for instance, of the story of St. Augustine. As long as he was a mere man of the world, a mere man drifting with his time, he actually was a Manichaean. It really was quite modern and fashionable to be a Manichaean. But when he became a Catholic, the people he instantly turned on and rent in pieces were the Manichaeans. The Catholic way of putting it is that he left off being a pessimist to become an ascetic. But as the pessimists interpreted asceticism, it might be said that he left off being an ascetic to become a saint. The war upon life, the denial of nature, were exactly the things he had already found in the heathen world outside the church, and had to renounce when he entered the church. The very fact that St. Augustine remains a somewhat sterner or sadder figure than St. Francis or St. Teresa only accentuates the dilemma. Face to face with the gravest or even grimmest of Catholics, we can still ask, why did Catholicism make war on Manichees if Catholicism was Manichaean? Take another rationalistic explanation of the rise of Christendom. It is common enough to find another critic saying Christianity did not really rise at all, that is, it did not merely rise from below, it was imposed from above. It is an example of the power of the executive, especially in despotic states. The empire was really an empire, that is, it was really ruled by the emperor. One of the emperors happened to become a Christian, he might just as well have become a Mithraist, or a Jew or a fire worshipper. It was common in the decline of the empire for eminent and educated people to adopt these eccentric Eastern cults. But when he adopted it, it became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and when it became the official religion of the Roman Empire, it became as strong, as official, and as invincible as the Roman Empire. It has only remained in the world as a relic of that empire, or, as many have put it, it is but the ghost of Caesar still hovering over Rome. This also is a very ordinary line taken in the criticism of orthodoxy, to say that it was only officialism that ever made it orthodoxy. And here again we can call on the heretics to refute it. The whole great history of the Arian heresy might have been invented to explode this idea. It is a very interesting history, often repeated in this connection, and the upshot of it is in that insofar as there ever was a merely official religion, it actually died because it was merely an official religion, and what destroyed it was the real religion. Arius advanced a version of Christianity which moved more or less vaguely in the direction of what we should call Unitarianism, though it was not the same, for it gave to Christ a curious intermediary position between the divine and human. The point is that it seemed to many more reasonable and less fanatical, and among these were many of the educated class in a sort of reaction against the first romance of conversion. Arians were a sort of moderates and a sort of modernists, and it was felt that after the first squabbles, this was the final form of rationalized religion into which civilization might well settle down. It was accepted by Divus Caesar himself and became the official orthodoxy. The generals and military princes drawn from the new barbarian powers of the north, full of the future, supported it strongly. But the sequel is still more important. Exactly as a modern man might pass through Unitarianism to complete agnosticism, so the greatest of the Arian emperors ultimately shed the last and thinnest pretense of Christianity. He abandoned even Arius and returned to Apollo. He was a Caesar of the Caesars, a soldier, a scholar, a man of large ambitions and ideals, another of the philosopher kings. It seemed to him as if at his signal the sun rose again. The oracles began to speak like birds beginning to sing at dawn. Paganism was itself again. The gods returned. It seemed the end of that strange interlude of an alien superstition. And indeed it was the end of it, so far as there was a mere interlude of mere superstition. It was the end of it insofar as it was the fad of an emperor or the fashion of a generation. If there really was something that began with Constantine, then it ended with Julian. But there was something that did not end. There had arisen in that hour of history, defiant above the democratic tumult of the councils of the Church, Athanasius against the world. We may pause upon the point at itself, because it is relevant to the whole of this religious history, and the modern world seems to miss the whole point of it. We might put it this way. If there is one question which the enlightened and liberal have the habit of deriding and holding up as a dreadful example of barren dogma and senseless sectarian strife, it is this Athanasian question of the co-eternity of the divine Son. On the other hand, if there is one thing that the same liberals always offer us as a piece of pure and simple Christianity, untroubled by doctrinal disputes, it is the single sentence God is love. Yet the two statements are almost identical. At least one is very nearly nonsense without the other. The barren dogma is only the logical way of stating the beautiful sentiment. For if there be a being without beginning, existing before all things, was he loving when there was nothing to be loved? If through that unthinkable eternity he is lonely, what is the meaning of saying he is love? The only justification of such a mystery is the mystical conception that in his own nature there was something analogous to self-expression, something of what begets and beholds what is begotten. Without some such idea, it is really illogical to complicate the ultimate essence of deity with an idea like love. If the moderns really want a simple religion of love, they must look for it in the Athanasian Creed. The truth is that the trumpet of true Christianity, the challenge of the charities and simplicities of Bethlehem or Christmas Day, never rang out more arrestingly and unmistakably than in the defiance of Athanasius to the cold compromise of the Arians. It was emphatically he who really was fighting for a God of love against a God of colourless and remote cosmic control, the God of the Stoics and the Agnostics. It was emphatically he who was fighting for the Holy Child against the grey deity of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He was fighting for that very balance of beautiful interdependence and intimacy in the very trinity of the divine nature that draws our hearts to the trinity of the Holy Family. His dogma, if the phrase be not misunderstood, turns even God into a holy family. That this purely Christian dogma actually for a second time rebelled against the empire, and actually for a second time refounded the church in spite of the empire, is itself a proof that there was something positive and personal working in the world, other than whatever official faith the empire chose to adopt. This power utterly destroyed the official faith that the empire did adopt. It went on its own way, as it is going on its own way still. There are any number of other examples in which is repeated precisely the same process we have reviewed in the case of the Manichaean and the Arian. A few centuries afterwards, for instance, the Church had to maintain the same Trinity, which is simply the logical side of love, against another appearance of the isolated and simplified deity in the religion of Islam. Yet there are some who cannot see what the Crusaders were fighting for, and some even who talk as if Christianity had never been anything but a form of what they call Hebraism coming in with the decay of Hellenism. Those people must certainly be very much puzzled by the war between the crescent and the cross. If Christianity had never been anything but a simpler morality sweeping away polytheism, there is no reason why Christianity should not have been swept into Islam. The truth is that Islam itself was a barbaric reaction against the very humane complexity that is really a Christian character, that idea of balance in the deity as of balance in the family that makes that creed a sort of sanity, and that sanity the soul of civilization. And that is why the Church is from the first a thing holding its own position and point of view quite apart from the accidents and anarchies of its age. That is why it deals blows impartially right and left at the pessimism of the Manichaean or the optimism of the Pelagian. It was not a Manichaean movement because it was not a movement at all. It was not an official fashion because it was not a fashion at all. It was something that could coincide with movements and fashions, could control them, and could survive them. So might rise from their graves the great heresiarchs to confound their comrades of today. There is nothing that the critics now affirm that we cannot call on these great witnesses to deny. The modern critic will say lightly enough that Christianity was but a reaction into asceticism and anti-natural spirituality, a dance of fakirs furious against life and love. But Manes, the great mystic, will answer them from his secret throne and cry, "These Christians have no right to be called spiritual. These Christians have no title to be called ascetics. They who compromised with the curse of life and all the filth of the family. Through them the earth is still foul with fruit and harvest, and polluted with population. Theirs was no movement against nature, or my children would have carried it to triumph. But these fools renewed the world, when I would have ended it with a gesture." And another critic will write that the Church was but the shadow of the empire, the fad of a chance emperor, and that it remains in Europe only as the ghost of the power of Rome. And Arius the deacon will answer out of the darkness of oblivion, "No, indeed, or the world would have followed my more reasonable religion. For mine went down before demagogues, and men defying Caesar, and around my champion was the purple cloak, and mine was the glory of the eagles. It was not for lack of these that I failed." And yet a third modern will maintain that the creed spread only as a sort of panic of hellfire, men everywhere attempting impossible things in fleeing from incredible vengeance, a nightmare of imaginary remorse. And such an explanation will satisfy many who see something dreadful in the doctrine of orthodoxy. And then there will go up against it the terrible voice of Tertullian, saying, "And why then was I cast out? And why did soft hearts and heads decide against me when I proclaimed the perdition of all sinners? And what was this power that thwarted me when I threatened all backsliders with hell? For none ever went up that hard road so far as I, and mine was the credo quia impossibili." Then there is the fourth suggestion, that there was something of the Semitic secret society in the whole matter, that it was a new invasion of the nomad spirit, shaking a kindlier and more comfortable paganism, its cities and its household gods, whereby the jealous monotheistic races could after all establish their jealous god. And Muhammad shall answer out of the whirlwind, the red whirlwind of the desert, "Who ever served the jealousy of God as I did, or left him more lonely in the sky? Who ever paid more honor to Moses and Abraham, or won more victories over idols and the images of paganism? And what was this thing that thrust me back with the energy of a thing alive, whose fanaticism could drive me from Sicily and tear up my deep roots out of the rock of Spain? What faith was theirs, who thronged in thousands of every class and country, crying out that my ruin was the will of God? And what hurled great Godfrey, as from a catapult, over the wall of Jerusalem? And what brought great Sobieski, like a thunderbolt, to the gates of Vienna? I think there was more than you fancy in the religion that has so matched itself with mine." Those who could suggest that the faith was a fanaticism are doomed to an eternal perplexity. In their account it is bound to appear as fanatical for nothing, and fanatical against everything. It is ascetical and at war with ascetics, Roman and in revolt against Rome, monotheistic and fighting furiously against monotheism, harsh in its condemnation of harshness, a riddle not to be explained even as unreason. And what sort of unreason is it that seems reasonable to millions of educated Europeans through all the revolutions of some 1600 years? People are not amused with a puzzle or a paradox or a mere muddle in the mind for all that time. I know of no reason except that such a thing is not unreason but reason, that if it is fanatical for reason and fanatical against all the unreasonable things. That is the only explanation I can find of a thing from the first so detached and so confident, condemning things that looked so like itself, refusing help from powers that seemed so essential to its existence, sharing on its human side all the passions of the age, yet always at the supreme moment suddenly rising superior to them, never saying exactly what it was expected to say, and never needing to unsay what it had said. I can find no explanation except that, like Pallas from the brain of Jove, it had indeed come forth out of the mind of God, mature and mighty and armed for judgment and for war. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The escape from paganism. The modern missionary with his palm leaf hat and his umbrella has become rather a figure of fun. He is chaffed among men of the world for the ease with which he can be eaten by cannibals, and the narrow bigotry which makes him regard the cannibal culture as lower than his own. Perhaps the best part of the joke is that the men of the world do not see that the joke is against themselves. It is rather ridiculous to ask a man just about to be boiled in a pot and eaten at a purely religious feast why he does not regard all religions as equally friendly and fraternal. But there is a more subtle criticism uttered against the more old-fashioned missionary, to the effect that he generalizes too broadly about the heathen and pays too little attention to the difference between Muhammad and mumbo-jumbo. There was probably truth in this complaint, especially in the past, but it is my main contention here that the exaggeration is all the other way at present. It is the temptation of the professors to treat mythologies too much as theologies, as things thoroughly thought out and seriously held. It is the temptation of the intellectuals to take much too seriously the fine shades of various schools in the rather irresponsible metaphysics of Asia. Above all, it is their temptation to miss the real truth implied in the idea of Aquinas contra Gentiles or Athanasius contra mundum. If the missionary says, in fact, that he is exceptional in being a Christian, and that the rest of the races and religions can be collectively classified as heathen, he is perfectly right. He may say it in quite the wrong spirit, in which case he is spiritually wrong, but in the cold light of philosophy and history he is intellectually right. He may not be right-minded, but he is right. He may not even have a right to be right, but he is right. The outer world, to which he brings his creed, really is something subject to certain generalizations covering all its varieties, and is not merely a variety of similar creeds. Perhaps it is in any case too much of a temptation to pride or hypocrisy to call it heathenry. Perhaps it would be better simply to call it humanity. But there are certain broad characteristics of what we call humanity, while it remains in what we call heathenry. They are not necessarily bad characteristics. Some of them are worthy of the respect of Christendom. Some of them have been absorbed and transfigured in the substance of Christendom. But they existed before Christendom, and they still exist outside Christendom, as certainly as the sea existed before a boat and all round a boat. And they have as strong and as universal and as unmistakable a savour as the sea. For instance, all real scholars who have studied the Greek and Roman cultures say one thing about it. They agree that in the ancient world religion was one and philosophy quite another. For instance, all real scholars who have studied the Greek and Roman culture say one thing about it. They agree that in the ancient world religion was one thing and philosophy quite another. There was very little effort to rationalize and at the same time to realize a real belief in the gods. There was very little pretense of any such real belief among the philosophers, but neither had the passion or perhaps the power to persecute the other, save in particular and peculiar cases, and neither the philosopher in his school nor the priest in his temple seems ever to have seriously contemplated his own concept as covering the world. A priest sacrificing to Artemis in Calydon did not seem to think that people would someday sacrifice to her instead of to Isis beyond the sea. A sage, following the vegetarian rule of the Neo-Pythagoreans, did not seem to think it would universally prevail and exclude the methods of Epictetus or Epicurus. We may call this liberality if we like. I am not dealing with an argument, but describing an atmosphere. All this, I say, is admitted by all scholars, but what neither the learned nor the unlearned have fully realized, perhaps, is that this description is really an exact description of all non-Christian civilization today, and especially of the great civilizations of the East. Eastern paganism really is much more all of a piece, just as ancient paganism was much more all of a piece, than the modern critics admit. It is a many-coloured Persian carpet, as the other was a varied and tessellated Roman pavement, but the one real crack right across that pavement came from the earthquake of the crucifixion. The modern European seeking his religion in Asia is reading his religion into Asia. Religion there is something different, it is both more and less. He is like a man mapping out the sea as land, marking waves as mountains, not understanding the nature of its peculiar permanence. It is perfectly true that Asia has its own dignity and poetry and high civilization, but it is not in the least true that Asia has its own definite dominions of moral government where all loyalty is conceived in terms of morality, as when we say that Ireland is Catholic or that New England was Puritan. The map is not marked out in religions in our sense of churches. The state of the mind is far more subtle, more variable, more secretive, more varied and changing, like the colours of the snake. The Muslim is the nearest approach to a militant Christian, and that is precisely because he is a much nearer approach to an envoy from Western civilization. The Muslim in the heart of Asia almost stands for the soul of Europe, and as he stands between them and Europe in the matter of space, so he stands between them and Christianity in the matter of time. In that sense, the Muslims in Asia are merely like the Nestorians in Asia. Islam, historically speaking, is the greatest of the Eastern heresies. It owed something to the quite isolated and unique individuality of Israel, but it owed more to Byzantium and the theological enthusiasm of Christendom. It owed something even to the Crusades. It owed nothing whatever to Asia. It owed nothing to the atmosphere of the ancient and traditional world of Asia, with its immemorial etiquette and its bottomless or bewildering philosophies. All that ancient and actual Asia felt the entrance of Islam as something foreign and Western and warlike, piercing it like a spear. Even where we might trace in dotted lines the domains of Asiatic religions, we should probably be reading into them something dogmatic and ethical belonging to our own religion. It is as if a European ignorant of the American atmosphere were to suppose that each state was a separate sovereign state as patriotic as France or Poland, or that when a Yankee referred fondly to his hometown, he meant he had no other nation like a citizen of ancient Athens or Rome. As he would be reading a particular sort of loyalty into America, so we are reading a particular sort of loyalty into Asia. There are loyalties of other kinds, but not what men in the West mean by being a believer, by trying to be a Christian, by being a good Protestant or a practicing Catholic. In the intellectual world, it means something far more vague and varied by doubts and speculations. In the moral world, it means something far more loose and drifting. A professor of Persian at one of our great universities, so passionate a partisan of the East as practically to profess a contempt for the West, said to a friend of mine, "You will never understand Oriental religions because you always conceive religion as connected with ethics. This kind has really nothing to do with ethics. We have most of us known some masters of the higher wisdom, some pilgrims upon the path to power, some Eastern esoteric saints and seers who had really nothing to do with ethics. Something different, something detached and irresponsible, tinges the moral atmosphere of Asia and touches even that of Islam. It was very realistically caught in the atmosphere of Hassan, and a very horrible atmosphere too. It is even more vivid in such glimpses as we get of the genuine and ancient cults of Asia. Deeper than the depths of metaphysics, far down in the abysses of mystical meditations, under all that solemn universe of spiritual things, is a secret, an intangible and a terrible levity. It does not really very much matter what one does, either because they do not believe in a devil or because they do not believe in a destiny, or because experience here is everything and eternal life something totally different, but for some reason they are totally different. I have read somewhere that there were 3 great friends famous in medieval Persia for their unity of mind. One became the responsible and respected vizier of the great king. The second was the poet Omar, pessimist and Epicurean, drinking wine in mockery of Muhammad. The third was the old man of the mountain, who maddened his people with hashish, that they might murder other people with daggers. It does not really matter what one does. The Sultan in Hassan would have understood all those three men, indeed he was all those three men. But this sort of universalist cannot have what we call a character, it is what we call a chaos. He cannot choose, he cannot fight, he cannot repent, he cannot hope. He is not in the same sense creating something, for creation means rejection. He is not, in our religious phrase, making his soul. For our doctrine of salvation does really mean a labour like that of a man trying to make a statue beautiful, a victory with wings. For that there must be a final choice. For a man cannot make statues without rejecting stone, and there really is this ultimate unmorality behind the metaphysics of Asia. And the reason is that there has been nothing through all those unthinkable ages to bring the human mind sharply to the point, to tell it that the time has come to choose. The mind has lived too much in eternity. The soul has been too immortal, in the special sense that it ignores the idea of mortal sin. It has had too much of eternity in the sense that it has not had enough of the hour of death and the day of judgment. It is not crucial enough in the literal sense that it has not had enough of the cross. This is what we mean when we say that Asia is very old. But strictly speaking, Europe is quite as old as Asia. Indeed, in a sense, any place is as old as any other place. What we mean is that Europe has not merely gone on growing older, it has been born again. Asia is all humanity, as it has worked out its human doom. Asia, in its vast territory, in its varied populations, in its heights of past achievement, and its depths of dark speculation, is itself a world and represents something of what we mean when we speak of the world. It is a cosmos rather than a continent. It is the world as man has made it, and contains many of the most wonderful things that man has made. Therefore Asia stands as the one representative of paganism and the one rival to Christendom. But everywhere else, where we get glimpses of that mortal destiny, they suggest stages in the same story. Where Asia trails away into the southern archipelagos of the savages, or where a darkness full of nameless shapes dwells in the heart of Africa, or where the last survivors of lost races linger in the cold volcano of prehistoric America, it is all the same story, sometimes perhaps later chapters of the same story. It is men entangled in the forest of their own mythology. It is men drowned in the sea of their own metaphysics. Polytheists have grown weary of the wildest of fictions. Monotheists have grown weary of the most wonderful of truths. Diabolists here and there have such a hatred of heaven and earth that they have tried to take refuge in hell. It is the fall of man, and it is exactly that fall that was being felt by our own fathers at the first moment of the Roman decline. We also were going down that wide road, down that easy slope, following the magnificent procession of the high civilizations of the world. If the Church had not entered the world then, it seems probable that Europe would be now very much what Asia is now. Something may be allowed for a real difference of race and environment, visible in the ancient as in the modern world. But after all, we talk about the changeless East very largely because it has not suffered the great change. Paganism in its last phase showed considerable signs of becoming equally changeless. This would not mean that new schools or sects of philosophy would not arise, as new schools did arise in antiquity and do arise in Asia. It does not mean that there would be no real mystics or visionaries, as there were mystics in antiquity and are mystics in Asia. It does not mean that there would be no social codes, as there were codes in antiquity and are codes in Asia. It does not mean that there could not be good men or happy lives, for God has given all men a conscience, and conscience can give all men a kind of peace. But it does mean that the tone and proportion of all these things, and especially the proportion of good and evil things, would be in the unchanged West what they are in the changeless East. And nobody who looks at that changeless East honestly and with a real sympathy can believe that there is anything there remotely resembling the challenge and revolution of the faith. In short, if classic paganism had lingered until now, a number of things might well have lingered with it, and they would look very like what we call the religions of the East. There would still be Pythagoreans teaching reincarnation, as there are still Hindus teaching reincarnation. There would still be Stoics making a religion out of reason and virtue, as there are still Confucians making a religion out of reason and virtue. There would still be Neoplatonists studying transcendental truths, the meaning of which was mysterious to other people and disputed even amongst themselves, as the Buddhists still study a transcendentalism mysterious to others and disputed among themselves. There would still be intelligent Apollonians apparently worshipping the sun god, but explaining that they were worshipping the divine principle, just as there are still intelligent Parsis apparently worshipping the sun, but explaining that they are worshipping the deity. There would still be wild Dionysians dancing on the mountain, as there are still wild dervishes dancing in the desert. There would still be crowds of people attending the popular feasts of the gods, in pagan Europe as in pagan Asia. There would still be crowds of gods, local and other, for them to worship. And there would still be a great many more people who worshipped them than people who believed in them. Finally, there would still be a very large number of people who did worship gods and did believe in gods, and who believed in gods and worshipped gods simply because they were demons. There would still be Levantines secretly sacrificing to Moloch, as there are still thugs secretly sacrificing to Kali. There would still be a great deal of magic, and a great deal of it would be black magic. There would still be a considerable admiration of Seneca and a considerable imitation of Nero, just as the exalted epigrams of Confucius could coexist with the tortures of China. And over all that tangled forest of traditions, growing wild or withering, would brood the broad silence of a singular or even nameless mood, but the nearest name of it is nothing. All these things, good and bad, would have an indescribable air of being too old to die. None of these things occupying Europe in the absence of Christendom would bear the least likeness to Christendom. Since the Pythagorean metempsychosis would still be there, we might call it the Pythagorean religion as we talk about the Buddhist religion. As the noble maxims of Socrates would still be there, we might call it the Socratic religion as we talk about the Confucian religion. As the popular holiday was still marked by a mythological hymn to Adonis, we might call it the religion of Adonis as we talk about the religion of Juggernaut. As literature would still be based on the Greek mythology, we might call that mythology a religion as we call the Hindu mythology a religion. We might say that there were so many thousands or millions of people belonging to that religion in the sense of frequenting such temples or merely living in a land full of such temples. But if we called the last tradition of Pythagoras or the lingering legend of Adonis by the name of a religion, then we must find some other name for the Church of Christ. If anybody says that the philosophic maxims preserved through many ages, or mythological temples frequented by many people, are things of the same class and category as the Church, it is enough to answer quite simply that they are not. Nobody thinks they are the same when he sees them in the old civilization of Greece and Rome. Nobody would think they were the same if that civilization had lasted 2,000 years longer and existed at the present day. Nobody can in reason think they are the same in the parallel pagan civilization in the East as it is at the present day. None of these philosophies or mythologies are anything like a church, certainly nothing like a church militant. And, as I have shown elsewhere, even if this rule were not already proved, the exception would prove the rule. The rule is that pre-Christian or pagan history does not produce a church militant, and the exception, or what some would call the exception, is that Islam is at least militant if it is not church. And that is precisely because Islam is the one religious rival that is not pre-Christian and therefore not in that sense pagan. Islam was a product of Christianity, even if it was a byproduct, even if it was a bad product. It was a heresy or parody emulating and therefore imitating the Church. It is no more surprising that Mohammedism had something of her fighting spirit than that Quakerism had something of her peaceful spirit. After Christianity, there are any number of such emulations or extensions. Before it, there are none. The church militant is thus unique because it is an army marching to effect a universal deliverance. The bondage from which the world is thus to be delivered is something that is very well symbolized by the state of Asia as by the state of pagan Europe. I do not mean merely their moral or immoral state. The missionary, as a matter of fact, has much more to say for himself than the enlightened imagine, even when he says that the heathen are idolatrous and immoral. A touch or two of realistic experience about Eastern religion, even about Muslim religion, will reveal some startling insensibilities in ethics, such as the practical indifference to the line between passion and perversion. It is not prejudice but practical experience that says that Asia is full of demons as well as gods. But the evil, I mean, is in the mind, and it is in the mind wherever the mind has worked for a long time alone. It is what happens when all dreaming and thinking have come to an end in an emptiness that is at once negation and necessity. It sounds like an anarchy, but it is also a slavery. It is what has been called already the wheel of Asia, all those recurrent arguments about cause and effect, or things beginning and ending in the mind, which make it impossible for the soul really to strike out and go anywhere or do anything. And the point is that it is not necessarily peculiar to Asiatics. It would have been true in the end of Europeans if something had not happened. If the church militant had not been a thing marching, all men would have been marking time. If the church militant had not endured a discipline, all men would have endured a slavery. What the universal yet fighting faith brought into the world was hope. Perhaps the one thing common to mythology and philosophy was that both were really sad, in the sense that they had not this hope even if they had touches of faith or charity. We may call Buddhism a faith, though to us it seems more like a doubt. We may call the Lord of Compassion a Lord of Charity, though it seems to us a very pessimist sort of pity. But those who insist most on the antiquity and size of such cults must agree that in all their ages they have not covered all their areas with that sort of practical and pugnacious hope. In Christendom, hope has never been absent. Rather, it has been errant, extravagant, excessively fixed upon fugitive chances. Its perpetual revolution and reconstruction has at least been an evidence of people being in better spirits. Europe did very truly renew its youth like the eagles, just as the eagles of Rome rose again over the legions of Napoleon, or we have seen soaring but yesterday the silver eagle of Poland. But in the Polish case, even revolution always went with religion. Napoleon himself sought a reconciliation with religion. Religion could never be finally separated even from the most hostile of the hopes, simply because it was the real source of the hopefulness. And the cause of this is to be found simply in the religion itself. Those who quarrel about it seldom even consider it in itself. There is neither space nor place for such a full reconciliation here, but a word may be said to explain a reconciliation that always recurs and still seems to require explanation. There will be no end to the weary debates about liberalizing theology until people face the fact that the only liberal part of it is really the dogmatic part. If dogma is incredible, it is because it is incredibly liberal. If it is irrational, it can only be in giving us more assurance of freedom than is justified by reason. The obvious example is that essential form of freedom which we call free will. It is absurd to say that a man shows his liberality in denying his liberty. But it is tenable that he has to affirm a transcendental doctrine in order to affirm his liberty. There is a sense in which we might reasonably say that if man has a primary power of choice, he has in that fact a supernatural power of creation, as if he could raise the dead or give birth to the unbegotten. Possibly in that case a man must be a miracle, and certainly in that case he must be a miracle in order to be a man, and most certainly in order to be a free man. But it is absurd to forbid him to be a free man and do it in the name of a more free religion. But it is true in 20 other matters. Anybody who believes at all in God must believe in the absolute supremacy of God. But insofar as that supremacy does allow of any degrees that can be called liberal or illiberal, it is self-evident that the illiberal power is the deity of the rationalists, and the liberal power is the deity of the dogmatists. Exactly in proportion as you turn monotheism into monism, you turn it into despotism. It is precisely the unknown God of the scientist, with his impenetrable purpose and his inevitable and unalterable law, that reminds us of a Prussian autocrat making rigid plans in a remote tent and moving mankind like machinery. It is precisely the God of miracles and of answered prayers who reminds us of a liberal and popular prince receiving petitions, listening to parliaments, and considering the cases of a whole people. I am not now arguing the rationality of this conception in other respects. As a matter of fact, it is not, as some suppose, irrational, for there is nothing irrational in the wisest and most well-informed king acting differently according to the action of those he wishes to save. But I am here only noting the general nature of liberality, or of free or enlarged atmosphere of action. And in this respect, it is certain that the king can only be what we call magnanimous if he is what some call capricious. It is the Catholic who has the feeling that his prayers do make a difference when offered for the living and the dead, who also has the feeling of living like a free citizen in something almost like a constitutional commonwealth. It is the monist who lives under a single iron law, who must have the feeling of living like a slave under a sultan. Indeed, I believe that the original use of the word suffragium, which we now use in politics for a vote, was that employed in theology about a prayer. The dead in purgatory were said to have the suffrages of the living. In this sense, of a sort of right of petition to the supreme ruler, we may truly say that the whole of the communion of saints, as well as the whole of the church militant, is founded on universal suffrage. But above all, it is true of the most tremendous issue of that tragedy which has created the divine comedy of our creed. Nothing short of the extreme and strong and startling doctrine of the divinity of Christ will give that particular effect that can truly stir the popular sense like a trumpet. The idea of the king himself serving in the ranks like a common soldier. By making that figure merely human, we make that story much less human. We take away the point of the story which actually pierces humanity. The point of the story which was quite literally the point of a spear. It does not especially humanize the universe to say that good and wise men can die for their opinions, any more than it would be any sort of uproariously popular news in an army that good soldiers may easily get killed. It is no news that King Leonidas is dead any more than that Queen Anne is dead, and men did not wait for Christianity to be men, in the full sense of being heroes. But if we are describing for the moment the atmosphere of what is generous and popular and even picturesque, any knowledge of human nature will tell us that no sufferings of the sons of men or even of the servants of God strike the same note as the notion of the master suffering instead of his servants. And this is given by the theological and emphatically not by the scientific deity. No mysterious monarch hidden in his starry pavilion at the base of the cosmic campaign is in the least like that celestial chivalry of the captain who carries his 5 wounds in the front of battle. What the denouncer of dogma really means is not that dogma is bad, but rather that dogma is too good to be true. That is, he means that dogma is too liberal to be likely. Dogma gives man too much freedom when it permits him to fall. Dogma gives even God too much freedom when it permits him to die. That is what the intelligent skeptics ought to say, and it is not in the least my intention to deny that there is something to be said for it. They mean that the universe is itself a universal prison, that existence itself is a limitation and a control, and it is not for nothing that they call causation a chain. In a word, they mean quite simply that they cannot believe these things, not in the least that they are unworthy of belief. We say, not lightly but very literally, that the truth has made us free. They say that it makes us so free that it cannot be the truth. To them it is like believing in fairyland to believe in such freedom as we enjoy. It is like believing in men with wings to entertain the fancy of men with wills. It is like accepting a fable about a squirrel in conversation with a mountain to believe in a man who is free to ask, or a God who is free to answer. This is a manly and a rational negation for which I, for one, shall always show respect. But I decline to show any respect for those who first of all clip the wings and cage the squirrel, rivet the chains and refuse the freedom, close all the doors of the cosmic prison on us with a clang of eternal iron, tell us that our emancipation is a dream and our dungeon a necessity, and then calmly turn round and tell us that they have a freer thought and a more liberal theology. The moral of all this is an old one, that religion is revelation. In other words, it is a vision, and a vision received by faith, but it is a vision of reality. The faith consists in a conviction of its reality. That, for example, is the difference between a vision and a daydream. And that is the difference between religion and mythology. That is the difference between faith and all that fancy work, quite human and more or less healthy, which we considered under the head of mythology. There is something in the reasonable use of the very word vision that implies 2 things about it. First, that it comes very rarely, possibly that it comes only once, and secondly, that it probably comes once and for all. A daydream may come every day. A daydream may be different every day. It is something more than the difference between telling ghost stories and meeting a ghost. But if it is not a mythology, neither is it a philosophy. It is not a philosophy because, being a vision, it is not a pattern but a picture. It is not one of those simplifications which resolve everything into abstract explanation, as that everything is recurrent, or everything is relative, or everything is inevitable, or everything is elusive. It is not a process but a story. It has proportions of the sort seen in a picture or a story. It has not the regular repetitions of a pattern or a process, but it replaces them by being convincing as a picture or a story is convincing. In other words, it is exactly, as the phrase goes, like life, for indeed it is life. An example of what is meant here might well be found in the treatment of the problem of evil. It is easy enough to make a plan of life of which the background is black, as the pessimists do, and then admit a speck or two of stardust more or less accidental, or at least in the literal sense insignificant. And it is easy enough to make another plan on white paper, as the Christian scientists do, and explain or explain away somehow such dots or smudges as may be difficult to deny. Lastly, it is easiest of all, perhaps, to say as the dualists do, that life is like a chessboard, in which the two are equal, and can as truly be said to consist of white squares on a blackboard, or of black squares on a whiteboard. But every man feels in his heart that none of these three paper plans is like life, that none of these worlds is one in which he can live. Something tells him that the ultimate idea of a world is not bad or even neutral. Staring at the sky or the grass or the truths of mathematics or even a new-laid egg, he has a vague feeling like the shadow of that saying of the great Christian philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas, every existence as such is good. On the other hand, something else tells him that it is unmanly and debased and even diseased to minimize evil to a dot or even a blot. He realizes that optimism is morbid. It is, if possible, even more morbid than pessimism. These vague but healthy feelings, if he followed them out, would result in the idea that evil is in some way an exception, but an enormous exception, and ultimately that evil is an invasion, or yet more truly a rebellion. He does not think that everything is right, or that everything is wrong, or that everything is equally right and wrong. But he does think that right has a right to be right, and therefore a right to be there. And wrong has no right to be wrong, and therefore no right to be there. It is the prince of the world, but it is also a usurper. So he will apprehend vaguely what the vision will give him vividly, no less than all that strange story of treason in heaven and the great desertion by which evil damaged and tried to destroy a cosmos that it could not create. It is a very strange story, and its proportions and its lines and colours are as arbitrary and absolute as the artistic composition of a picture. It is a vision which we do in fact symbolize in pictures by titanic limbs and passionate tints of plumage, all that abysmal vision of falling stars and the peacock panoplies of the night. But that strange story has one small advantage over the diagrams. It is like life. Another example might be found, not in the problem of evil, but in what is called the problem of progress. One of the ablest agnostics of the age once asked me whether I thought mankind grew better or grew worse or remained the same. He was confident that the alternative covered all possibilities. He did not see that it only covered patterns and not pictures, processes and not stories. I asked him whether he thought that Mr. Smith of Golders Green got better or worse or remained exactly the same between the age of 30 and 40. It then seemed to dawn on him that it would depend rather on Mr. Smith and how he chose to go on. It had never occurred to him that it might depend on how mankind chose to go on, and that its course was not a straight line or an upward or downward curve, but a track like that of a man across a valley, going where he liked and stopping where he chose, going into a church or falling drunk into a ditch. The life of man is a story, an adventure story, and in our vision the same is true even of the story of God. The Catholic faith is the reconciliation because it is the realization both of mythology and philosophy. It is a story, and in that sense one of 100 stories, only it is a true story. It is a philosophy, and in that sense one of 100 philosophies, only it is a philosophy that is like life. But above all, it is a reconciliation because it is something that can only be called the philosophy of stories. That normal narrative instinct which produced all the fairy tales is something that is neglected by all the philosophies except one. The faith is the justification of that popular instinct, the finding of a philosophy for it, or the analysis of the philosophy in it. Exactly as a man in an adventure story has to pass various tests to save his life, so the man in this philosophy has to pass several tests and save his soul. In both, there is an idea of free will operating under conditions of design. In other words, there is an aim, and it is the business of man to aim at it. We therefore watch to see whether he will hit it. Now, this deep and democratic and dramatic instinct is derided and dismissed in all the other philosophies. For all the other philosophies avowedly end where they begin, and it is the definition of a story that it ends differently, that it begins in one place and ends in another. From Buddha and his wheel to Akhenaten and his disc, from Pythagoras with his abstraction of number to Confucius with his religion of routine, there is not one of them that does not in some way sin against the soul of a story. There is none of them that really grasps this human notion of the tale, the test, the adventure, the ordeal of the free man. Each of them starves the storytelling instinct, so to speak, and does something to spoil human life considered as a romance, either by fatalism, pessimist or optimist, and that destiny that is the death of adventure, or by indifference and that detachment that is the death of drama, or by a fundamental skepticism that dissolves the actors into atoms, or by a materialistic limitation blocking the vista of moral consequences, or a mechanical recurrence making even moral tests monotonous, or a bottomless relativity making even practical tests insecure. There is such a thing as a human story, and there is such a thing as the divine story, which is also a human story, but there is no such thing as a Hegelian story, or a monist story, or a relativist story, or a determinist story. For every story, yes, even a penny dreadful or a cheap novelette, has something in it that belongs to our universe and not theirs. Every short story does truly begin with creation and end with the last judgment. And that is the reason why the myths and the philosophers were at war until Christ came. That is why the Athenian democracy killed Socrates out of respect for the gods, and why every strolling sophist gave himself the airs of a Socrates whenever he could talk in a superior fashion of the gods, and why the heretic Pharaoh wrecked his huge idols and temples for an abstraction, and why the priests could return in triumph and trample his dynasty underfoot, and why Buddhism had to divide itself from Brahmanism, and why in every age and country outside Christendom there has been a feud forever between the philosopher and the priest. It is easy enough to say that the philosopher is generally the more rational. It is easier still to forget that the priest is always the more popular. For the priest told the people stories, and the philosopher did not understand the philosophy of stories. It came into the world with the story of Christ. And this is why it had to be a revelation or vision given from above. Anyone who will think of the theory of stories or pictures will easily see the point. The true story of the world must be told by somebody to somebody else. By the very nature of a story, it cannot be left to occur to anybody. A story has proportions, variations, surprises, particular dispositions, which cannot be worked out by rule in the abstract, like a sum. We could not deduce whether or no Achilles would give back the body of Hector from a Pythagorean theory of number or recurrence, and we could not infer for ourselves in what way the world would get back the body of Christ merely from being told that all things go round and round upon the wheel of Buddha. A man might perhaps work out a proposition of Euclid without having heard of Euclid, but he would not work out the precise legend of Eurydice without having heard of Eurydice. At any rate, he would not be certain how the story would end, whether Orpheus was ultimately defeated. Still less could he guess the end of our story, or the legend of our Orpheus rising not defeated from the dead. To sum up, the sanity of the world was restored, and the soul of man offered salvation by something which did indeed satisfy the two warring tendencies of the past, which had never been satisfied in full, and most certainly never satisfied together. It met the mythological search for romance by being a story, and the philosophical search for truth by being a true story. That is why the ideal figure had to be a historical character, as nobody had ever felt Adonis or Pan to be a historical character. But that is also why the historical character had to be the ideal figure, and even fulfill many of the functions given to these other ideal figures. Why he was at once the sacrifice and the feast, why he could be shown under the emblems of the growing vine or the rising sun. The more deeply we think of the matter, the more we shall conclude that if there be indeed a God, his creation could hardly have reached any other culmination than this granting of a real romance to the world. Otherwise, the two sides of the human mind could never have touched at all, and the brain of man would have remained cloven and double, one lobe of it dreaming impossible dreams and the other repeating invariable calculations. The picture makers would have remained forever painting the portrait of nobody. The sages would have remained forever adding up numerals that came to nothing. It was that abyss that nothing but an incarnation could cover, a divine embodiment of our dreams, and he stands above that chasm whose name is more than priest and older even than Christendom, Pontifex Maximus, the mightiest maker of a bridge. But even with that, we return to the more specially Christian symbol in the same tradition, the perfect pattern of the keys. This is a historical and not a theological outline, and it is not my duty here to defend in detail that theology, but merely to point out that it could not even be justified in design without being justified in detail, like a key. Beyond the broad suggestion of this chapter, I attempt no apologetic about why the creed should be accepted, but in answer to the historical query of why it was accepted and is accepted, I answer for millions of others in my reply, because it fits the lock, because it is like life. It is one among many stories, only it happens to be a true story. It is one among many philosophies, only it happens to be the truth. We accept it, and the ground is still solid under our feet, and the road is open before us. It does not imprison us in a dream of destiny or a consciousness of the universal delusion. It opens to us not only incredible heavens, but what seems to some an equally incredible earth, and makes it credible. This is the sort of truth that is hard to explain because it is a fact. But it is a fact to which we can call witnesses. We are Christians and Catholics, not because we worship a key, but because we have passed a door and felt the wind that is the trumpet of liberty blow over the land of the living. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The 5 Deaths of the Faith. It is not the purpose of this book to trace the subsequent history of Christianity, especially the later history of Christianity, which involves controversies of which I hope to write more fully elsewhere. It is devoted only to the suggestion that Christianity, appearing amid heathen humanity, had all the character of a unique thing, and even of a supernatural thing. It was not like any of the other things, and the more we study it, the less it looks like any of them. But there is a certain rather peculiar character which marked it henceforward, even down to the present moment, with a note on which this book may well conclude. I have said that Asia and the ancient world had an air of being too old to die. Christendom has had the very opposite fate. Christendom has had a series of revolutions, and in each one of them Christianity has died. Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave. But the first extraordinary fact which marks this history is this, that Europe has been turned upside down over and over again, and that at the end of each of these revolutions the same religion has again been found on top. The faith is always converting the age, not as an old religion, but as a new religion. This truth is hidden from many by a convention that is too little noticed. Curiously enough, it is a convention of the sort which those who ignore it claim especially to detect and denounce. They are always telling us that priests and ceremonies are not religion, and that religious organization can be a hollow sham, but they hardly realize how true it is. It is so true that 3 or 4 times at least in the history of Christendom the whole soul seemed to have gone out of Christianity, and almost every man in his heart expected its end. This fact is only masked in medieval or other times by that very official religion which such critics pride themselves on seeing through. Christianity remained the official religion of a Renaissance prince, or the official religion of an 18th century bishop, just as an ancient mythology remained the official religion of Julius Caesar, or the Arian creed long remained the official religion of Julian the Apostate. But there was a difference between the cases of Julius and of Julian, because the Church had begun its strange career. There was no reason why men like Julius should not worship gods like Jupiter forever in public and laugh at them forever in private. But when Julian treated Christianity as dead, he found it had come to life again. He also found, incidentally, that there was not the faintest sign of Jupiter ever coming to life again. This case of Julian and the episode of Arianism is but the first in a series of examples that can only be roughly indicated here. Arianism, as has been said, had every human appearance of being the natural way in which that particular superstition of Constantine might be expected to peter out. All the ordinary stages had been passed through. The creed had become a respectable thing, had become a ritual thing, had then been modified into a rational thing, and the rationalists were ready to dissipate the last remains of it, just as they do today. When Christianity rose again suddenly and through them, it was almost as unexpected as Christ rising from the dead. But there are many other examples of the same thing, even about the same time. The rush of missionaries from Ireland, for example, has all the air of an unexpected onslaught of young men on an old world, and even on a church that showed signs of growing old. Some of them were martyred on the coast of Cornwall, and the chief authority on Cornish antiquities told me that he did not believe for a moment that they were martyred by heathens, but, as he expressed it with some humour, by rather slack Christians. Now, if we were to dip below the surface of history, as it is not in the scope of this argument to do, I suspect that we should find several occasions when Christendom was thus to all appearances hollowed out from within by doubt and indifference, so that only the old Christian shell stood as the pagan shell had stood so long. But the difference is that in every case the sons were fanatical for the faith where the fathers had been slack about it. This is obvious in the case of the transition from the Renaissance to the Counter-Reformation. It is obvious in the case of a transition from the 18th century to many Catholic revivals of our own time, but I suspect many other examples which would be worthy of separate studies. The faith is not a survival. It is not as if the Druids had managed somehow to survive somewhere for 2,000 years. That is what might have happened in Asia or ancient Europe, in that indifference or tolerance in which mythologies and philosophies could live forever side by side. It has not survived, it has returned again and again in this Western world of rapid change and institutions perpetually perishing. Europe, in the tradition of Rome, was always trying revolution and reconstruction, rebuilding a universal republic. And it always began by rejecting this old stone and ended by making it the head of the corner, by bringing it back from the rubbish heap to make it the crown of the capital. Some stones of Stonehenge are standing and some are fallen, and as the stone falleth, so shall it lie. There has not been a Druidic renaissance every century or two, with the young Druids crowned with fresh mistletoe, dancing in the sun on Salisbury Plain. Stonehenge has not been rebuilt in every style of architecture, from the rude round Norman to the last Rococo of the Baroque. The sacred place of the Druids is safe from the vandalism of restoration. But the Church in the West was not in a world where things were too old to die, but in one in which they were always young enough to get killed. The consequence was that superficially and externally it often did get killed, nay, it sometimes wore out even without getting killed. And there follows a fact, I find it somewhat difficult to describe, yet which I believe to be very real and rather important. As a ghost is the shadow of a man, and in that sense the shadow of life, so at intervals there passed across this endless life a sort of shadow of death. It came at the moment when it would have perished had it been perishable. It withered away everything that was perishable. If such animal parallels were worthy of the occasion, we might say that the snake shuddered and shed its skin and went on, or even that the cat went into convulsions as it lost only one of its 999 lives. It is truer to say in a more dignified image that a clock struck and nothing happened, or that a bell tolled for an execution that was everlastingly postponed. What was the meaning of all that dim but vast unrest of the 12th century, when, as it has been so finely said, Julian stirred in his sleep? Why did there appear so strangely early in the twilight of dawn after the Dark Ages so deep a skepticism as that involved in urging nominalism against realism? For realism against nominalism was really realism against rationalism, or something more destructive than what we call rationalism. The answer is that just as some might have thought the Church simply a part of the Roman Empire, so others later might have thought the Church only a part of the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages ended as the Empire had ended, and the Church should have departed with them, if she had not been also one of the shades of night. It was another of those spectral deaths or simulations of death. I mean that if nominalism had succeeded, it would have been as if Arianism had succeeded. It would have been the beginning of a confession that Christianity had failed. For nominalism is a far more fundamental skepticism than mere atheism. Such was the question that was openly asked as the Dark Ages broadened into that daylight that we call the modern world. But what was the answer? The answer was Aquinas in the chair of Aristotle, taking all knowledge for his province, and tens of thousands of lads down to the lowest ranks of peasant and serf, living in rags and on crusts about the great colleges, to listen to the scholastic philosophy. What was the meaning of all that whisper of fear that ran round the West under the shadow of Islam and fills every old romance with incongruous images of Saracen knights swaggering in Norway or the Hebrides? Why were men in the extreme West, such as King John, if I remember rightly, accused of being secretly Muslims, as men are accused of being secretly atheists? Why was there that fierce alarm among some of the authorities about the rationalistic Arab version, or Aristotle? Authorities are seldom alarmed like that except when it is too late. The answer is that hundreds of people probably believed in their hearts that Islam would conquer Christendom, that Averroes was more rational than Anselm, that the Saracen culture was really, as it was superficially, a superior culture. Here again we should probably find a whole generation, the older generation, very doubtful and depressed and weary. The coming of Islam would only have been the coming of Unitarianism 1,000 years before its time. To many it may have seemed quite reasonable and quite probable and quite likely to happen. If so, they would have been surprised at what did happen. What did happen was a roar like thunder from thousands and thousands of young men, throwing all their youth into one exultant countercharge, the Crusades. It was the sons of St. Francis, the jugglers of God, wandering singing over all the roads of the world. It was the Gothic, going up like a flight of arrows. It was the waking of the world. In considering the war of the Albigensians, we come to the breach in the heart of Europe and the landslide of a new philosophy that nearly ended Christendom forever. In that case, the new philosophy was also a very new philosophy. It was pessimism. It was none the less like modern ideas because it was as old as Asia. Most modern ideas are. It was the Gnostics returning, but why did the Gnostics return? Because it was the end of an epoch, like the end of the empire, and should have been the end of the church. It was Schopenhauer hovering over the future, but it was also Manichaeus rising from the dead, that men might have death, and that they might have it more abundantly. It is rather more obvious in the case of the Renaissance, simply because the period is so much nearer to us, and people know so much more about it. But there is more even in that example than most people know. Apart from the peculiar controversies which I wish to reserve for a separate study, the period was far more chaotic than those controversies commonly imply. When Protestants call Latimer a martyr to Protestantism, and Catholics reply that Campion was a martyr to Catholicism, it is often forgotten that many perished in such persecutions could only be described as martyrs to atheism or anarchism or even diabolism. That world was almost as wild as our own. The men wandering about in it included the sort of man who says there is no God, the sort of man who says he is himself God, the sort of man who says something that nobody can make head or tail of. If we could have the conversation of the age following the Renaissance, we should probably be shocked by its shameless negations. The remarks attributed to Marlowe are probably pretty typical of the talk in many intellectual taverns. The transition from pre-Reformation to post-Reformation Europe was through a void of very yawning questions, yet again in the long run the answer was the same. It was one of those monuments when As Christ walked on the water, so was Christianity walking in the air. But all these cases are remote in date and could only be proved in detail. We can see the fact much more clearly in the case when the paganism of the Renaissance ended Christianity, and Christianity unaccountably began all over again. But we can see it most clearly of all in the case which is close to us and full of manifest and minute evidence, the case of the great decline of religion that began about the time of Voltaire. For indeed it is our own case, and we ourselves have seen the decline of that decline. The 200 years since Voltaire do not flash past us at a glance like the 4th and 5th centuries or the 12th and 13th centuries. In our own case, we can see this oft-repeated process close at hand. We know how completely a society can lose its fundamental religion without abolishing its official religion. We know how men can all become agnostics long before they abolish bishops. And we know that also in this last ending, which really did look to us like the final ending, the incredible thing has happened again. The faith has a better following among the young men than among the old. When Ibsen spoke of the new generation knocking at the door, he certainly never expected that it would be the church door. At least 5 times, therefore, with the Arian and with the Albigensian, with the humanist skeptic, after Voltaire and after Darwin, the faith has, to all appearance, gone to the dogs. In each of these 5 cases, it was the dog that died. How complete was the collapse, and how strange the reversal, we can only see in detail in the case nearest to our own time. 1,000 things have been said about the Oxford movement and the parallel French Catholic revival, but few have made us feel the simplest fact about it, that it was a surprise. It was a puzzle as well as a surprise, because it seemed to most people like a river turning backwards from the sea and trying to climb back into the mountains. To have read the literature of the 18th and 19th centuries is to know that nearly everybody had come to take it for granted that religion was a thing that would continually broaden like a river till it reached an infinite sea. Some of them expected it to go down in a cataract of catastrophe. Most of them expected it to widen into an estuary of equality and moderation. But all of them thought its returning on itself a prodigy as incredible as witchcraft. In other words, most moderate people thought that faith, like freedom, would be slowly broadened down, and some advanced people thought that it would be very rapidly broadened down, not to say flattened out. All that world of Guizot and Macaulay and the commercial and scientific liberality was perhaps more certain than any man before or since about the direction in which the world is going. People were so certain about the direction that they only differed about the pace. Many anticipated with alarm, and a few with sympathy, a Jacobin revolt that should guillotine the Archbishop of Canterbury, or a Chartist riot that should hang the parsons on the lampposts. But it seemed like a convulsion in nature that the Archbishop, instead of losing his head, should be looking for his mitre, and that instead of diminishing the respect due to parsons, we should strengthen it to the respect due to priests. It revolutionized their very vision of revolution, and turned their very topsy-turvydom topsy-turvy. In short, the whole world being divided about whether the stream was going slower or faster, became conscious of something vague but vast that was going against the stream. Both in fact and figure there is something deeply disturbing about this, and that for an essential reason. A dead thing can go with the stream, but only a living thing can go against it. A dead dog can be lifted on the leaping water with all the swiftness of a leaping hound, but only a live dog can swim backwards. A paper boat can ride the rising deluge with all the airy arrogance of a fairy ship, but if the fairy ship sails upstream, it is really rowed by the fairies. And among the things that merely went with the tide of apparent progress and enlargement, there was many a demagogue or sophist, whose wild gestures were in truth as lifeless as the movement of a dead dog's limbs wavering in the eddying water, and many a philosophy uncommonly like a paper boat, of the sort that it is not difficult to knock into a cocked hat. And even the truly living and even life-giving things that went with that stream did not thereby prove that they were living or life-giving. It was this other force that was unquestionably and unaccountably alive, the mysterious and unmeasured energy that was thrusting back the river. That was felt to be like the movement of some great monster, and it was nonetheless clearly a living monster because most people thought it a prehistoric monster. It was nonetheless an unnatural and incongruous and to some a comic upheaval, as if the great sea serpent had suddenly risen out of the round pond, unless we consider the sea serpent as more likely to live in the serpentine. This flippant element in the fantasy must not be missed, for it was one of the clearest testimonies to the unexpected nature of the reversal. That age did really feel that a preposterous quality in prehistoric animals belonged also to historic rituals, that mitres and tiaras were like the horns or crests of antediluvian creatures, and that appealing to a primitive church was like dressing up as a primitive man. The world is still puzzled by that movement, but most of all because it still moves. I have said something elsewhere of the rather random sort of reproaches that are still directed against it, and its much greater consequences. It is enough to say here that the more such critics reproach it, the less they explain it. In a sense, it is my concern here, if not to explain it, at least to suggest the direction of the explanation. But above all, it is my concern to point out one particular thing about it, and that is that it had all happened before, and even many times before. To sum up, insofar as it is true that recent centuries have seen an attenuation of Christian doctrine, recent centuries have only seen what the most remote centuries have seen. And even the modern example has only ended as the medieval and pre-medieval examples ended. It is already clear, and grows clearer every day, that it is not only going to end in the disappearance of the diminished creed, but rather in the return of those parts of it that had really disappeared. It is going to end as the Arian compromise ended, as the attempts at a compromise with nominalism and even with Albigensianism ended. But the point to seize in the modern case, as in all other cases, is that what returns is not in that sense a simplified theology, not according to that view a purified theology. It is simply theology. It is that enthusiasm for theological studies that marked the old doctrinal ages. It is the divine science. An old Don with DD after his name may have become the typical figure of a bore, but that was because he was himself bored with his theology, not because he was excited about it. It was precisely because he was admittedly more interested in the Latin of Plautus than in the Latin of Augustine, in the Greek of Xenophon than in the Greek of Chrysostom. It was precisely because he was more interested in a dead tradition than in a decidedly living tradition. In short, it was precisely because he was himself a type of the time in which Christian faith was weak. It was not because men would not hail, if they could, the most wonderful and almost wild vision of a doctor of divinity. There are people who say they wish Christianity to remain as a spirit. They mean very literally that they wish it to remain as a ghost. But it is not going to remain as a ghost. What follows this process of apparent death is not the lingering of the shade, it is the resurrection of the body. These people are quite prepared to shed pious and reverential tears over the sepulchre of the Son of Man. What they are not prepared for is the Son of Man walking once more upon the hills of mourning. These people, and indeed most people, were indeed by this time quite accustomed to the idea that the old Christian candlelight would fade into the light of common day. To many of them, it did quite honestly appear like that pale yellow flame of a candle when it is left burning in daylight. It was all the more unexpected, and therefore all the more unmistakable, that the seven-branched candlestick suddenly towered to heaven like a miraculous tree, and flamed until the sun turned pale. But other ages have seen the day conquer the candlelight, and then the candlelight conquer the day. Again and again, before our time, men have grown content with a diluted doctrine, and again there has followed on that dilution, coming as out of the darkness in a crimson cataract, the strength of the red original wine. And we only say once more today, as has been said many times by our fathers, long years and centuries ago our fathers, or the founders of our people, drank as they dreamed of the blood of God. Long years and centuries have passed since the strength of that giant vintage has been anything but a legend of the age of giants. Centuries ago already is the dark time of the second fermentation, when the wine of Catholicism turned into the vinegar of Calvinism. Long since that bitter drink has been itself diluted, rinsed out and washed away by the waters of oblivion and the wave of the world. Never did we think to taste again even that bitter tang of sincerity, and the spirit, still less the richer and the sweeter strength of the purple vineyards in our dreams of the age of gold. Day by day and year by year, we have lowered our hopes and lessened our convictions. We have grown more and more used to seeing those vats and vineyards overwhelmed in the water floods, and the last savour and suggestion of that special element fading like a stain of purple upon a sea of grey. We have grown used to dilution, to disillusion, to a watering down that went on forever. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. This is the final fact, and it is the most extraordinary of all. The faith has not only often died, but it has often died of old age. It has not only been often killed, but it has often died a natural death in the sense of coming to a natural and necessary end. It is obvious that it has survived the most savage and the most universal persecutions, from the shock of the Diocletian fury to the shock of the French Revolution. But it has a more strange and even a more weird tenacity. It has survived not only war but peace. It has not only died often but degenerated often and decayed often. It has survived its own weakness and even its own surrender. We need not repeat what is so obvious about the beauty of the end of Christ in its wedding of youth and death. But this is almost as if Christ had lived to the last possible span, had been a white-haired sage of 100 and died of natural decay, and then had risen again rejuvenated with trumpets and the rending of the sky. It was said truly enough that human Christianity in its recurrent weakness was sometimes too much wedded to the powers of the world, but if it was wedded, it has very often been widowed. It is a strangely immortal sort of widow. An enemy may have said at one moment that it was but an aspect of the power of the Caesars. It sounds as strange today as to call it an aspect of the pharaohs. An enemy might say that it was the official faith of feudalism, and it sounds as convincing now as to say that it was bound to perish with the ancient Roman villa. All these things did indeed run their course to its normal end, and there seemed no course for the religion but to end with them. It ended, and it began again. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. The civilization of antiquity was the whole world, and men no more dreamed of its ending than of the ending of daylight. They could not imagine another order unless it were in another world. The civilization of the world has passed away, and those words have not passed away. In the long night of the Dark Ages, feudalism was so familiar a thing that no man could imagine himself without a lord, and religion was so woven into that network that no man would have believed they could be torn asunder. Feudalism itself was torn to rags and rotted away in the popular life of the true Middle Ages, and the first and freshest power in that new freedom was the old religion. Feudalism had passed away, and the words did not pass away. The whole medieval order, in many ways so complete and almost cosmic a home for man, wore out gradually in its turn, and here at least it was thought that the words would die. They went forth across the radiant abyss of the Renaissance, and in 50 years were using all its light and learning for new religious foundations, new apologetics, new saints. It was supposed to have been withered up at last in the dry light of the Age of Reason. It was supposed to have disappeared ultimately in the earthquake of the Age of Revolution. Science explained it away, and it was still there. History disinterred it in the past, and it appeared suddenly in the future. Today it stands once more in our path, and even as we watch it, it grows. If our social relations and records retain their continuity, if men really learn to apply reason to the accumulating facts of so crushing a story, it would seem that sooner or later even its enemies will learn from their incessant and interminable disappointments not to look for anything so simple as its death. They may continue to war with it, but it will be as they war with nature, as they war with the landscape, as they war with the skies. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. They will watch for it to stumble, they will watch for it to err, they will no longer watch for it to end. Insensibly, even unconsciously, They will, in their own silent anticipations, fulfill the relative terms of that astounding prophecy. They will forget to watch for the mere extinction of what has so often been vainly extinguished, and will learn instinctively to look first for the coming of the comet or the freezing of the star. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Conclusion, the summary of the book. I have taken the liberty once or twice of borrowing the excellent phrase about an outline of history, though this study of a special truth and a special error can of course claim no sort of comparison with the rich and many-sided encyclopedia of history for which that name was chosen. And yet there is a certain reason in the reference, and a sense in which the other thing touches and even cuts across the other. For the story of the world as told by Mr. Wells could here only be criticized as an outline. And strangely enough, it seems to me that it is only wrong as an outline. It is admirable as an accumulation of history. It is splendid as a storehouse or treasury of history. It is a fascinating disquisition on history. It is most attractive as an amplification of history, but it is quite false as an outline of history. The one thing that seems to me quite wrong about it is the outline, the sort of outline that can really be a single line like that which makes all the difference between a caricature of the profile of Mr. Winston Churchill and of Sir Alfred Mond. In simple and homely language, I mean the things that stick out, the things that make the simplicity of a silhouette. I think the proportions are wrong, the proportions of what is certain as compared with what is uncertain, of what played a great part as compared with what played a smaller part, of what is ordinary and what is extraordinary, of what really lies level with an average and what stands out as an exception. I do not say it as a small criticism of a great writer, and I have no reason to do so. For in my own much smaller task I feel I have failed in very much the same way. I am very doubtful whether I have conveyed to the reader the main point I meant about the propositions of history, and why I have dwelt so much more on some things than others. I doubt whether I have clearly fulfilled the plan that I set out in the introductory chapter, and for that reason I add these lines as a sort of summary in a concluding chapter. I do believe that the things on which I have insisted are more essential to an outline of history than the things which I have subordinated or dismissed. I do not believe that the past is most truly pictured as a thing in which humanity merely fades away into nature, or civilization merely fades away into barbarism, or religion fades away into mythology, or our own religion fades away into the religions of the world. In short, I do not believe that the best way to produce an outline of history is to rub out the lines. I believe that of the two, it would be far nearer the truth to tell the tale very simply, like a primitive myth about a man who made the sun and stars, or a god who entered the body of a sacred monkey. I will therefore sum up all that has gone before in what seems to me a realistic and reasonably proportioned statement: the short story of mankind. In the land lit by that neighbouring star whose blaze is the broad daylight, there are many and very various things, motionless and moving. There moves among them a race that is, in its relation to others, a race of gods. The fact is not lessened but emphasized because it can behave like a race of demons. Its distinction is not an individual illusion like one bird pluming itself on its own plumes. It is a solid and a many-sided thing. It is demonstrated in the very speculations that have led to its being denied. That men, the gods of this lower world, are linked with it in various ways is true, but it is another aspect of the same truth. That they grow as the grass grows and walk as the beasts walk is a secondary necessity that sharpens the primary distinction. It is like saying that a magician must after all have the appearance of a man, or that even the fairies could not dance without feet. It has lately been the fashion to focus the mind entirely on these mild and subordinate resemblances and to forget the main fact altogether. It is customary to insist that man resembles the other creatures. Yes, and that very resemblance he alone can see. The fish does not trace the elephant bone pattern in the fowls of the air, or the elephant and the emu compare skeletons. Even in the sense in which man is at one with the universe, it is an utterly lonely universality. The very sense that he is united with all things is enough to sunder him from all. Looking around him by this unique light, as lonely as the literal flame that he alone has kindled, this demigod or demon of the visible world makes that world visible. He sees around him a world of a certain style or type. It seems to proceed by certain rules or at least repetitions. He sees a green architecture that builds itself without visible hands, but which builds itself into a very exact plan or pattern, like a design already drawn in the air by an invisible finger. It is not, as is now vaguely suggested, a vague thing. It is not a growth or a groping of blind life. Each seeks an end, a glorious and radiant end, even for every daisy or dandelion we see in looking across the level of a common field. In the very shape of things there is more than green growth, there is the finality of the flower. It is a world of crowns. This impression, whether or no it be an illusion, has so profoundly influenced this race of thinkers and masters of the material world that the vast majority have been moved to take a certain view of that world. They have concluded, rightly or wrongly, that the world had a plan, as the tree seemed to have a plan, and an end and crown like the flower. But so long as the race of thinkers was able to think, it was obvious that the admission of this idea of a plan brought with it another thought more thrilling and even terrible. There was someone else, some strange and unseen being who had designed these things, if indeed they were designed. There was a stranger who was also a friend, a mysterious benefactor who had been before them and built up the woods and hills for their coming, and had kindled the sunrise against their rising as a servant kindles a fire. Now this idea of a mind that gives a meaning to the universe has received more and more confirmation with the minds of men by meditations and experiences much more subtle and searching than any such argument about the external plan of the world. But I am concerned here with keeping the story in its most simple and even concrete terms, and it is enough to say here that most men, including the wisest men, have come to the conclusion that the world has such a final purpose and therefore such a first cause. But most men, in some sense, separated themselves from the wisest men when it came to the treatment of that idea. There came into existence two ways of treating that idea, which between them make up most of the religious history of the world. The majority, like the minority, had this strong sense of a second meaning in things, of a strange master who knew the secret of the world. But the majority, the mob or mass of men, naturally tended to treat it rather in the spirit of gossip. The gossip, like all gossip, contained a great deal of truth and falsehood. The world began to tell itself tales about the unknown being or his sons or servants or messengers. Some of the tales may truly be called old wives' tales, as professing only to be very remote memories of the morning of the world. Some of them might more truly be called travellers' tales, as being curious but contemporary tales brought from certain borderlands of experience, such as miraculous cures or those that bring whispers of what has happened to the dead. Many of them are probably true tales. Enough of them are probably true to keep a person of real common sense more or less conscious that there really is something rather marvellous behind the cosmic curtain. But in a sense, it is only going by appearances, even if the appearances are called apparitions. It is a matter of appearances and disappearances. At the most, these gods are ghosts, that is, they are glimpses. For most of us, they are rather gossip about glimpses. And for the rest, the whole world is full of rumours, most of which are almost avowedly romances. The great majority of the tales about gods and ghosts and the invisible king are told, if not for the sake of the tale, at least for the sake of the topic. They are evidence of the external interest of the theme. They are not evidence of anything else, and they are not meant to be. They are mythology or the poetry that is not bound in books or bound in any other way. Meanwhile, the minority, the sages or thinkers, had withdrawn apart and had taken up an equally congenial trade. They were drawing up plans of the world which all believed to have a plan. They were trying to set forth the plan seriously and to scale. They were setting their minds directly to the mind that had made the mysterious world, considering what sort of a mind it might be and what its ultimate purpose might be. Some of them made that mind much more impersonal than mankind has generally made it. Some simplified it almost to a blank. A very few, doubted it altogether. One or two of the more morbid fancied that it might be evil and an enemy. Just one or two of the more degraded in the other class worshipped demons instead of gods. But most of these theorists were theists, and they not only saw a moral plan in nature, but they generally laid down a moral plan for humanity. Most of them were good men who did good work, and they were remembered and reverenced in various ways. They were scribes, and their scriptures became more or less holy scriptures. They were lawgivers, and their tradition became not only legal but ceremonial. We may say that they received divine honours in the sense in which kings and great captains in certain countries often received divine honours. In a word, wherever the other popular spirit, the spirit of legend and gossip, could come into play, it surrounded them with the more mystical atmosphere of the myths. Popular poetry turned the sages into saints. But that was all it did. They remained themselves. Men never really forgot that they were men, only made into gods in the sense that they were made into heroes. Divine Plato, like Divus Caesar, was a title and not a dogma. In Asia, where the atmosphere was more mythical, the man was made to look more like a myth, but he remained a man. He remained a man of a certain special class or school of men, receiving and deserving great honour from mankind. It is the order or school of the philosophers, the men who have set themselves seriously to trace the order across any apparent chaos in the vision of life. Instead of living on imaginative rumours and remote traditions, and the tail end of exceptional experiences about the mind and meaning behind the world, they have tried, in a sense, to project the primary purpose of that mind a priori. They have tried to put on paper a possible plan of the world, almost as if the world were not yet made. Right in the middle of all these things stands up an enormous exception. It is quite unlike anything else. It is a thing final, like the trump of doom, though it is also a piece of good news, or news that seems too good to be true. It is nothing less than the loud assertion that this mysterious maker of the world has visited his world in person. It declares that really, and even recently, or right in the middle of historic times, there did walk into the world this original invisible being, about whom the thinkers make theories and the mythologists hand down myths. The man who made the world. That such a higher personality exists behind all things had indeed always been implied by all the best thinkers, as well as by all the most beautiful legends. But nothing of this sort had ever been implied in any of them. It is simply false to say that the other sages and heroes had claimed to be that mysterious master and maker of whom the world had dreamed and disputed. Not one of them had ever claimed to be anything of the sort. Not one of their sects or schools had ever claimed that they had claimed to be anything of the sort. The most that any religious prophet had said was that he was the true servant of such a being. The most that any visionary had ever said was that men might catch glimpses of the glory of that spiritual being, or much more often of lesser spiritual beings. The most that any primitive myth had ever suggested was that the Creator was present at the creation, but that the Creator was present at scenes a little subsequent to the supper parties of Horace, and talked with tax collectors and government officials in the detailed daily life of the Roman Empire, and that this fact continued to be firmly asserted by the whole of that great civilization for more than 1,000 years. That is something utterly unlike anything else in nature. It is the one great startling statement that man has made since he spoke his first articulate word instead of barking like a dog. Its unique character can be used as an argument against it as well as for it. It would be easy to concentrate on it as a case of isolated insanity, but it makes nothing but dust and nonsense of comparative religion. It came on the world with a wind and rush of running messengers proclaiming that apocalyptic portent, and it is not unduly fanciful to say that they are running still. What puzzles the world and its wise philosophers and fanciful pagan poets about the priests and people of the Catholic Church is that they still behave as if they were messengers. A messenger does not dream about what his message might be, or argue about what it probably would be. He delivers it as it is. It is not a theory or a fancy, but a fact. It is not relevant to this intentionally rudimentary outline to prove in detail that it is a fact. but merely to point out that these messengers do deal with it as men deal with a fact. All that is condemned in Catholic tradition, authority and dogmatism, and the refusal to retract and modify, are but the natural human attributes of a man with a message relating to a fact. I desire to avoid in this last summary all the controversial complexities that may once more cloud the simple lines of that strange story, which I have already called, in words that are much too weak, the strangest story in the world. I desire merely to mark those main lines, and specially to mark where the great line is really to be drawn. The religion of the world, in its right proportions, is not divided into fine shades of mysticism or more or less rational forms of mythology. It is divided by the line between the men who are bringing that message and the men who have not yet heard it or cannot yet believe it. But when we translate the terms of that strange tale back into the more concrete and complicated terminology of our time, we find it covered by names and memories of which the very familiarity is a falsification. For instance, when we say that a country contains so many Muslims, we mean really that it contains so many monotheists, and we really mean by that it contains so many men with the old average assumption of men that the invisible ruler remains invisible. They hold it along with the customs of a certain culture and under the simpler laws of a certain lawgiver, but so they would if their lawgiver were Lycurgus or Solon. They testify to something which is a necessary and noble truth, but was never a new truth. Their creed is not a new colour, it is the neutral and normal tint that is the background of the many-coloured life of man. Muhammad did not, like the Magi, find a new star. He saw through his own particular window a glimpse of the great grey field of the ancient starlight. So when we say that the country contains so many Confucians or Buddhists, we mean it contains so many pagans whose prophets have given them another and rather vaguer version of the invisible power, making it not only invisible but also impersonal. When we say that they also have temples and idols and priests and periodical festivals, we simply mean that this sort of heathen is enough of a human being to admit the popular element of pomp and pictures and feasts and fairy tales. We only mean that pagans have more sense than Puritans. But what the gods are supposed to be, what the priests are commissioned to say, is not a sensational secret like what those running messengers of the gospel had to say. Nobody else except those messengers has any gospel. Nobody else has any good news, for the simple reason that nobody else has any news. Those runners gather impetus as they run. Ages afterwards, they still speak as if something had just happened. They have not lost the speed and momentum of messengers. They have hardly lost, as it were, the wild eyes of witnesses. In the Catholic Church, which is the cohort of the message, there are still those headlong acts of holiness that speak of something rapid and recent, a self-sacrifice that startles the world like a suicide. But it is not a suicide, it is not pessimistic, it is still as optimistic as St. Francis of the flowers and birds. It is newer in spirit than the newest schools of thought, and it is almost certainly on the eve of new triumphs. For these men serve a mother who seems to grow more beautiful as new generations rise up and call her blessed. We might sometimes fancy that the Church grows younger as the world grows old. For this is the last proof of the miracle that something so supernatural should have become so natural. I mean that anything so unique when seen from the outside should only seem universal when seen from the inside. I have not minimized the scale of the miracle as some of our milder theologians think it wise to do. Rather have I deliberately dwelt on that incredible interruption as a blow that broke the very backbone of history. I have great sympathy with the monotheists, the Muslims, or the Jews, to whom it seems a blasphemy that might shake the world. But it did not shake the world, it steadied the world. That fact, the more we consider it, will seem more solid and more strange. I think it a piece of plain justice to all the unbelievers to insist upon the audacity of the act of faith that is demanded of them. I willingly and warmly agree that it is in itself a suggestion at which we might expect even the brain of the believer to reel when he realized his own belief. But the brain of the believer does not reel, it is the brains of the unbelievers that reel. We can see their brains reeling on every side and into every extravagance of ethics and psychology. into pessimism and the denial of life, into pragmatism and the denial of logic, seeking their omens in nightmares and their canons in contradictions, shrieking for fear at the far-off sight of things beyond good and evil, or whispering of strange stars where 2 and 2 make 5. Meanwhile, this solitary thing that seems at first so outrageous in outline remains solid and sane in substance. It remains the moderator of all these manias, rescuing reason from the pragmatists exactly as it rescued laughter from the Puritans. I repeat that I have deliberately emphasized its intrinsically defiant and dogmatic character. The mystery is how anything so startling should have remained defiant and dogmatic and yet become perfectly normal and natural. I have admitted freely that, considering the incident in itself, a man who says he is God may be classed with a man who says he is glass, but the man who says he is glass is not a glazier making windows for all the world. He does not remain for after ages as a shining and crystalline figure in whose light everything is as clear as crystal. But this madness has remained sane. The madness has remained sane when everything else went mad. The madhouse has been a house to which, age after age, men are continually coming back as to a home. That is the riddle that remains, that anything so abrupt and abnormal should still be found a habitable and hospitable thing. I care not if the skeptic says it is a tall story. I cannot see how so toppling a tower could stand so long without foundation. Still less can I see how it could become, as it has become, the home of man. Had it merely appeared and disappeared, it might possibly have been remembered or explained as the last leap of the rage of illusion, the ultimate myth of the ultimate mood in which the mind struck the sky and broke. But the mind did not break. It is the one mind that remains unbroken in the break-up of the world. If it were an error, it seems as if the error could hardly have lasted a day. If it were a mere ecstasy, it would seem that such an ecstasy could not endure for an hour. It has endured for nearly 2,000 years, and the world within it has been more lucid, more level-headed, more reasonable in its hopes, more healthy in its instincts, more humorous and cheerful in the face of fate and death than all the world outside. For it was the soul of Christendom that came forth from the incredible Christ, and the soul of it was common sense. Though we dared not look on his face, we could look on his fruits, and by his fruits we should know him. The fruits are solid, and the fruitfulness is much more than a metaphor, and nowhere in this sad world are boys happier in apple trees, or men in more equal chorus singing as they tread the vine, than under the fixed flash of this instant and intolerant enlightenment, the lightning made eternal as the light. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendices. Appendix 1. On Prehistoric Man. On rereading these pages, I feel that I have tried in many places and with many words to say something that might be said in one word. In a sense, this study is meant to be superficial. That is, it is not meant as a study of the things that need to be studied. It is rather a reminder of the things that are seen so quickly that they are forgotten almost as quickly. Its moral, in a manner of speaking, is that first thoughts are best, so a flash might reveal a landscape, with the Eiffel Tower or the Matterhorn standing up in it, as they would never stand up again in the light of common day. I ended the book with an image of everlasting lightning. In a very different sense, alas, this little flash has lasted only too long. But the method has also certain practical disadvantages upon which I think it well to add these 2 notes. It may seem to simplify too much and to ignore out of ignorance. I feel this especially in the passage about the prehistoric pictures, which is not concerned with all that the learned may learn from prehistoric pictures, but with a single point of what anybody could learn from there being any prehistoric pictures at all. I am conscious that this attempt to express it in terms of innocence may exaggerate even my own ignorance. Without any pretense of scientific research or information, I should be sorry to have it thought that I knew no more than what was needed in that passage of the stages into which primitive humanity has been divided. I am aware, of course, that the story is elaborately stratified, and that there were many such stages before the Cro-Magnon, or any peoples with whom we associate such pictures. Indeed, recent studies about the Neanderthal and other races rather tend to repeat the moral that is here most relevant, the notion noted in these pages of something necessarily slow or late in the development of religion will gain little indeed from these later revelations about the precursors of the reindeer picture maker. The learned appear to hold that, whether the reindeer picture could be religious or not, the people that lived before it were religious already, burying their dead with the significant signs of mystery and hope. This obviously brings us back to the same argument, an argument that is not approached by any measurement of the earlier man's skull. It is little use here to compare the head of the man with the head of the monkey, if it certainly never came into the head of the monkey to bury another monkey with nuts in his grave to help him towards a heavenly monkey house. Talking of skulls, I am also aware of the story of the Cro-Magnon skull that was much larger and finer than a modern skull. It is a very funny story because an eminent evolutionist, awakening to a somewhat belated caution, protested against anything being inferred from one specimen. It is the duty of a solitary skull to prove that our fathers were our inferiors. Any solitary skull presuming to prove that they were superior is felt to be suffering from swelled head. Appendix 2. On Authority and Accuracy. In this book, which is merely meant as a popular criticism of popular fallacies, often indeed of very vulgar errors, I feel that I have sometimes given an impression of scoffing at serious scientific work. It was, however, the very reverse of my intentions. I am not arguing with the scientist who explains the elephant, but only with the sophist who explains it away. And as a matter of fact, the sophist plays to the gallery, as he did in ancient Greece. He appeals to the ignorant, especially when he appeals to the learned. But I never meant my own criticism to be an impertinence to the truly learned. We all owe an infinite debt to the researchers, especially the recent researchers, of single-minded students in these matters, and I have only professed to pick up things here and there from them. I have not loaded my abstract argument with quotations and references which only make a man look more learned than he is, but in some cases I find that my own loose fashion of allusion is rather misleading about my own meaning. The passage about Chaucer and the child martyr is badly expressed. I only mean that the English poet probably had in mind the English saint, of whose story he gives a sort of foreign version. In the same way, two statements in the chapter on mythology follow each other in such a way that it may seem to be suggested that the second story about monotheism refers to the southern seas. I may explain that Atahualcan belongs not to Australasian but to American savages. So in the chapter called The Antiquity of Civilization, which I feel to be the most unsatisfactory, I have given my own impression of the meaning of the development of Egyptian monarchy too much, perhaps, as if it were identical with the facts on which it was formed as given in works like those of Professor J. L. Myers. But the confusion was not intentional, still less was there any intention to imply, in the remainder of the chapter, that the anthropological speculations about races are less valuable than they undoubtedly are. My criticism is strictly relative. I may say that the pyramids are plainer than the tracks of the desert, without denying that wiser men than I may see tracks in what is to me the trackless sand. End of chapter 16. End of The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton.